The first sound was a blasphemy. A dry, metallic crack that ripped through the sacred silence of the reading room, echoing off the marble columns and soaring Ionian portico of the National Library of Greece. Eleni Petridis flinched, her hand jerking so that the needle-fine brush left a faint, unintended streak of crimson ink across the vellum page of the 14th-century psalter she was restoring. Another crack. Closer this time, followed by the distant, angry chatter of a machine gun. December, 1944. The Nazis were gone, but peace had not come to Athens. Instead, a new war, a brothers' war, had seeped into the city's ancient veins. The Decembriana. The sounds of the government forces and the EAMELAS partisans were the city's new, brutal heartbeat. But here, inside these hallowed walls, Eleni had maintained a fragile peace. Here, the only conflicts were the slow, patient wars against time, against the decay of paper and the fading of ink. She, at 28, was a veteran of these quiet battles. An orphan raised by the library's previous curator, she knew the building not as a workplace, but as the marrow of her bones. Its scent, a heady perfume of aging paper, leather, dust, and beeswax, was the only maternal comfort she had ever known. Her fingers, stained with the faint ghosts of pigments and chemicals, knew the texture of every manuscript, the weight of every incunabulum. She steadied her hand, her breath a controlled, silent thing. Her world was one of order. The precise calligraphy of a Byzantine gospel, the rigid logic of the cataloging system, the predictable path of the sun as it moved across the great glass ceiling high above. Outside, Athens was chaos. Inside, there was meaning. A voice, amplified by a loudspeaker, blared from the street, distorted and monstrous. It was the voice of Colonel Leonidas Stratos, the new military commander of the Athens garrison. Eleni had heard it on the radio, a voice of cold, hard iron, promising to purge the nation of the communist sickness, to cauterize the foreign infection with fire and steel. Any building harboring insurgents will be considered a legitimate military target, the voice boomed, the words vibrating against the tall windows. There will be no sanctuary for traitors. The glories of Greece will be forged anew, free from the decadent weakness of the past. Eleni set her brush down. A tremor ran through her hand that had nothing to do with the explosions. Decadent weakness, he meant this place. He meant the poets and the philosophers, the histories and the tragedies that lined these walls. He meant her. The grand clock at the far end of the hall struck 3. As if on cue, the massive oak doors at the front of the library shuddered, a deep groan of stressed wood. Then again. A splintering crash echoed through the building, a sound more violating than any gunshot. Shouts erupted from the entrance hall. Heavy, running footsteps. Eleni froze, her heart a cold stone in her chest. The chaos she had so carefully walled out had just kicked down her door. She moved on instinct. Her soft-soled shoes making no sound on the polished floors. Peering from behind a towering bookshelf, she saw them. A dozen men and women, ragged and gray with street dust and fear, spilled into the entrance hall. Some were armed with old rifles and pistols. One man, lean and dark-haired, his face grim with pain, was being half-carried by a younger boy. He slumped against a pillar, his trouser legs soaked in a dark, wet stain. They were partisans. Insurgents. The very people Colonel Stratos had promised to burn out. The man in charge, a broad-shouldered figure with a thick mustache, barked orders. Barricade it. Use the benches. Move. They began dragging the heavy reading benches, the sound of their scraping feet and the groaning would an agony to Eleni's ears. This was a desecration. A violation of the deepest grammar of her world. She stepped out from behind the shelf, her voice small but clear in the cavernous space. Stop. They all turned, surprised. To them, she must have looked like a ghost, a pale, slender woman in a dark cardigan, her face smudged with ink, her eyes wide behind steel-rimmed glasses. The leader stared at her. Who are you? I am the archivist, she said, her voice gaining a sliver of the authority she felt when handling a fragile manuscript. "This is a library. You cannot do this." He gave a harsh, disbelieving laugh. "Lady, there's a war out there. We need cover. This place is stone. It'll do." He gestured to the wounded man, who was now being tended to by a woman with a desperate look in her eyes. "My name is Nikos. That man needs a place to not die. Do you have a better idea?" Eleni looked at the wounded man, Nikos, and a wave of nausea washed over her. The smell of blood and sweat was overpowering the familiar scent of old paper. This was real. This was the chaos she feared, bleeding all over her clean, ordered floors. She looked past them, through the shattered doorway, and saw the street. Government soldiers were setting up a machine gun nest across the Panepistymia Avenue. This building wasn't just cover. It was a tomb. "You can't stay here," she whispered. "They'll destroy this place to get to you." "They'll destroy it anyway," the man with the mustache countered gruffly. "The colonel thinks books are poison. At least this way, it dies for something." The wounded man, Nikos, pushed himself upright, his face pale but his eyes sharp and intelligent. He looked directly at Eleni, past her fear, and seemed to see something else. "He's right," Nikos said, his voice raspy. "But she is too. They won't just besiege us. They will level it. Is there another way out? A back way? A service exit?" Eleni's mind, a library in itself, began to work. It flew through the building's floor plans, the endless corridors, the staff entrances, the delivery bays. Every one of them opened onto a street that was now a killing field. "No," she said, the word falling like a stone. "There is no other way out." The silence that followed was heavier than any book in the building. It was the silence of a sealed room. Outside, the loudspeaker crackled to life again, closer this time. "To the occupants of the National Library. You are harboring enemies of the state. You have 48 hours to surrender the building and all personnel within. After that, we will commence with its purification. By fire." The 48 hours were a lifetime lived in the space between heartbeats. The partisans, led by the pragmatic older man named Georgios, were grimly efficient. They barricaded the lower windows with tables and shelves of periodicals, the newer, replaceable books, Georgios had conceded, after a look of pure murder from Eleni. The wounded man, Nikos, had been laid out on a table in a quiet side office. The wound a clean but deep gash from shrapnel. A woman named Sophia, who had been a medical student, was tending to him with supplies from a small kit and strips of linen torn from discarded book wrappings. Eleni watched them, a foreigner in her own home. They moved with a desperate purpose she found both terrifying and magnetic. They spoke in low, urgent tones about munitions, lines of sight, and rendezvous points that no longer existed. Kale, she had learned, was the name of the broad-shouldered man, and he was their leader. He saw the world in terms of angles, cover, and ammunition counts. He looked at the library's marble columns and saw only shields. He looked at Eleni and saw only an obstacle. "We fight our way out tonight," Kale announced on the first evening, his voice a low rumble in the whispering silence of the hall of manuscripts. He, Eleni, and a few others were gathered around a single, low-wattage lamp. Under darkness. A quick, hard push towards Omonia. "We might lose a few, but we can't just sit here and be roasted." "It's suicide," Nikos said from his makeshift bed. He had refused to be left out of the planning. "Stratos will have the main avenues covered. They're expecting a breakout. It's what they want." "It's better than burning," another man muttered. Eleni said nothing. Her mind was racing, not with tactics of bullets and bodies, but with another kind of knowledge. The library was not just one building. It was a history of buildings. It had been built upon older foundations, renovated, expanded. Its skin was neoclassical, but its bones were a chaotic jumble of centuries. She had spent her life learning them. "There is another way," she said suddenly. The men turned to look at her. Not out. Through. Cale crossed his arms. What are you talking about, archivist? This library is connected, she began, the words coming faster as the idea took shape, the familiar thrill of academic discovery now twisted into something urgent and vital. The archives are in the basement. Not just the library's archives. City archives. They were moved here for safekeeping in the Great War. Drainage plans from the Ottoman period. Venetian water maps. Even, she took a breath, schematics for the old steam heating tunnels built in the 1920s. They were decommissioned, but they may not have been filled. Nikos was staring at her, his sharp eyes alight with understanding. Tunnels, he breathed. Under the city. They are not on any modern map, Eleni said, her confidence growing. But they are on my maps. They connect to the old gasworks near Karameikos. And to the cistern system beneath the Plaka. We can't fight our way out. But perhaps, we can disappear. Cale looked from Eleni to Nikos, his expression a mask of disbelief and dawning, reluctant hope. Show us, he said, his voice stripped of its earlier mockery. Show us your maps. The archives were a world of their own. A vast, subterranean labyrinth of rolling shelves and wooden cabinets, thick with the cold, dense air of time itself. The single lantern they carried threw long, dancing shadows, making the shelves look like the ribs of some great, sleeping beast. Eleni moved through the darkness with an unerring certainty, her fingers tracing the faded labels on wooden drawers. She pulled out a long, heavy drawer. Inside, rolled and tied with brittle string, were enormous linen-backed schematics. She unrolled one across a large sorting table, the paper crackling in protest. It was a beautiful, hand-drawn map of the city's steampipe network from 1928. A web of thick blue lines snaked beneath the familiar grid of Athens. Cale and Georgios leaned in, their faces illuminated by the lantern light. Here, Eleni said, her finger tracing a line. It was an act she had performed 1,000 times for visiting scholars, but now her finger was tracing a path to survival. This is us. The library's sub-basement. And this line, this main conduit, it runs west, under the old market, and emerges here. She tapped a point on the map. An access vault behind the old power station. 2 kilometers from here. Can we fit? Georgios asked, squinting at the annotations. The main conduits are 1.5 meters in diameter, according to the specifications, Eleni replied without hesitation. It will be tight. And dark. And God knows what is down there after 20 years. Nikos, who had insisted on being helped down to the archives, was studying Eleni's face in the flickering light. You never thought this was a weapon, did you? He asked quietly. Eleni looked up from the map, confused. It is not a weapon. It is a utility plan. Everything is a weapon now, Nikos said. Or a shield. Or a tomb. There's nothing else. He looked at Cale. She's right. This is better than your suicide run. We don't run. We vanish. And we use this secret geography, to hit them where they aren't looking. And so, the plan was born. Not a plan of escape, but of resistance. They would not abandon the library. They would turn it into a ghost station, a nerve center for a war fought in the city's hidden veins. The test run was 2 nights later. A small sabotage mission. Cale, Georgios, and 2 others. The target, a government army communications line running through a sewer junction 3 blocks away. Eleni was their guide. She did not go with them, but she might as well have. On a table in her office, she had the relevant map spread out, weighted down with books. She had memorized every turn, every junction, every risk. After 200 meters. You will reach a ladder marked 7A, she had instructed Cale, her voice clinical and precise. Do not take it. It leads to a grate on Petition Street. There is a guard post there. You must continue another 50 meters to the auxiliary junction. The schematics show a pressure valve there. That is your landmark. She sat in the darkness of her office, waiting. The library was silent around her, but in her mind. She was in the tunnels with them, counting their steps, breathing the stale, damp air. For the first time, her knowledge was not a passive thing. It was active, kinetic, deadly. Every meter of the map she had memorized was a meter of life or death for the men she had sent into the dark. It was a terrifying, exhilarating feeling. Hours later, they returned. Filthy, exhausted, but alive. And triumphant. It was exactly as you said, Cale told her. His voice holding a new note of awe. He placed a small piece of cut cable on the table beside her maps. We cut their field telephone lines to the main barracks. They'll be blind for hours. He looked at her clean hands and ink-stained fingers. The archivist, he said, a faint smile touching his lips. Who would have thought? The success sent a ripple of hope through the small group. But it also signed a death warrant. The next day, Colonel Stratos's voice was back on the loudspeakers, and it had lost its detached, ideological tone. It was furious. He spoke of cowardly rats hiding in the shadows, of saboteurs defiling the city's foundations. He announced that the area around the library was now under permanent curfew. No one in, no one out. He was no longer just planning to purge the library. He was hunting the ghost that haunted it. The war had become personal. The second mission was bolder, born of their initial success and a growing desperation. A supply truck was due to arrive at a small garrison near Syntagma Square. Nikos, whose leg was healing enough for him to plan but not to walk, had devised the strategy. It was a simple ambush. But the path to it was complex, a winding route through a maze of Ottoman-era sewers Eleni had found on a crumbling, water-stained map from 1850. The risk is the infrastructure itself, Eleni warned, her finger tracing a section of the map where the ink had bled into a brown smear. These tunnels haven't been maintained for over a century. They could be flooded, or collapsed. It's a risk we have to take, Nikos insisted from his chair. We're low on medical supplies. Sophia is using her last bandages. His eyes met Eleni's. And in them, she saw a silent plea. He was not just asking for a route, he was asking her to share the burden of the choice. She spent a day cross-referencing the old map with more recent geological surveys, looking for signs of subsidence, for new construction that might have obliterated the old paths. It was a scholar's work applied to a soldier's problem. Finally, she mapped a route she believed was 80% certain. The remaining 20% was a cold knot of dread in her stomach. Cale led the team again. This time, Eleni felt every tick of the clock as a physical blow. She sat in her office, the door closed, trying to lose herself in the familiar task of cataloging a new acquisition, a set of letters from a 19th-century poet. But the words blurred. The poet's gentle reflections on mortality seemed like a cruel joke. Her mind was in the dark, damp tunnels, imagining the scrape of boots on stone, the drip of unseen water, the sudden, terrifying silence of a wrong turn. They were gone for 6 hours. Then 8. Then 10. The knot in her stomach tightened into a vice. She had sent them to their deaths. Her certainty, her meticulous research, it was all academic vanity. In the real world, paper maps crumbled and tunnels collapsed. Just as she was succumbing to a quiet, cold despair, the door creaked open. It was Georgios, his face ashen, supporting a younger man whose arm was wrapped in a bloody rag. Cale followed, his expression grim. The tunnel flooded, he said, his voice flat. A water main broke sometime in the last 50 years. We had to backtrack. Found another way, but we ran right into a patrol. He gestured to the wounded man. Lefteris took a bullet. We got the supplies. Most of them. He dropped a canvas bag on the floor. It was smaller than they had hoped. But we lost the element of surprise. They know we're using the tunnels now. They'll be hunting us down there. Eleni looked at Lefteris, at the pain etched on his young face, at the blood seeping through the makeshift bandage. This blood was on her hands. The 20% uncertainty had a face now. The abstract risk had become a concrete human cost. The thrill she had felt after the first mission curdled into a sick, heavy guilt. The archivist, Nikos said softly, later that night. He had found her in the cavernous main hall, staring up at the glass dome where the moon now swam in a sea of black. This was not your fault, Eleni. It was the first time he had used her name. I gave them the map, she whispered, her voice trembling. I told them it was safe. You told them it was a chance, he corrected gently. In this war, a chance is more than anyone else has. You gave us that. Kale, he is angry at the world, not at you. You showed him a way to fight back. He shifted his weight, leaning on a table. Stratos, he is not a fool. He will learn. He will start sealing the tunnels, setting traps. Your weapon is becoming obsolete. Eleni felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. He was right. Her advantage, her secret knowledge, was finite. Stratos was adapting. He was a hunter closing in on his prey. And the library was their cage. The days that followed were taught with a new kind of fear. The enemy was no longer just outside, they were searching for a way in. The partisans grew restless, their confinement in the silent halls grating on nerves stretched thin by hunger and uncertainty. The distant sounds of battle were almost a comfort compared to the heavy, listening silence within the library walls. Stratos began a campaign of psychological warfare. His voice returned to the loudspeakers, but now it was directed, personal. He didn't speak to the city, he spoke to them. To the rats in the library, his amplified voice would begin, a daily ritual of torment. To the intellectuals and the criminals you protect. Your hidden paths are being closed. Your darkness will not hide you forever. Every day you remain, another piece of your city's heritage is forfeit. He was true to his word. One afternoon, the smell of acrid smoke drifted through the library. From a high window, they watched in horror as a squad of soldiers set fire to the university's small museum of folklore, its collection of traditional costumes and artifacts turning to black smoke under the gray Athenian sky. It was a message. This is what happens to the past. Eleni felt each of these attacks as a physical blow. Stratos wasn't just fighting a war, he was editing history, erasing every story that didn't fit his own brutal narrative. And he was using her love against her. It was Nikos who saw the change in her. He saw the way she retreated back into herself, the way her hands would shake as she tried to focus on her restoration work. A desperate attempt to reclaim some small piece of her ordered world. He's trying to break you, he said one evening, finding her in the geography section, staring blankly at a wall of atlases. He knows the resistance is coming from here. He knows it's clever. He thinks if he can crush the city's spirit, he can crush the person guiding it. He is succeeding, Eleni murmured. How can I fight him? My maps are useless now. He is sealing the tunnels. Kale and his men are trapped here with us. You are thinking like an archivist, Nikos said, his voice firm. You are thinking about how to use what is already written. But this war, it requires a new text. He gestured around them, at the towering shelves, the iron balconies, the marble floors. You used the library's secrets to fight in the city. What if you used the library itself as the weapon? Eleni looked at him, uncomprehending. What do you mean? This building, he said, his eyes scanning the cavernous space. You know it better than anyone. Its weaknesses, its strengths, its strange echoes and hidden corners. You told me you were a child here. You must have played in every inch of it. His words sparked something in her memory. A flash of herself as a small girl, playing hide-and-seek with the old curator, finding a hollow space behind a bookshelf in the philosophy section, discovering that the old dumbwaiter system from the 19th century still worked, its ropes and pulleys hidden behind a wall panel. She remembered the strange acoustics of the main dome, how a whisper in one corner could be heard clearly in another. She looked around the reading room, but this time, she wasn't seeing a sanctuary. She was seeing a battlefield. She was seeing the iron spiral staircases of the stacks as defensible high ground. The heavy, rolling ladders as mobile barricades. The long, narrow corridors as kill zones. The knowledge that had been her childhood comfort was reconfiguring itself in her mind, becoming tactical, deadly. The library was not a cage. It was a fortress. And she had the key. Yes, she said. A new, hard light in her eyes. Yes, I think I do. The assault came at dawn. Not with a loudspeaker's warning, but with the deafening roar of a shaped charge blowing the main oak doors off their hinges. Chaos erupted. The blast threw dust and splinters of wood deep into the entrance hall. Through the smoke-filled breach, the first wave of Stratos's soldiers charged in, shouting, their rifles raised. But this time, the defenders were ready. Kale and his small band were not clustered at the entrance. They were positioned where Eleni had told them to be. 2 men on the first-floor balcony, behind a barricade of overturned marble pedestals, laying down covering fire. Georgios and another at the end of the main corridor, using the long, narrow space as a shooting gallery. Eleni was not with them. She was 2 floors up. In a small, forgotten office overlooking the main hall, a place she had chosen for its view and its multiple escape routes. With her were Sophia and the young boy who had helped carry Nikos. The office held the library's old internal telephone system, a relic from the 1930s that still connected to key points in the building. It was her command center. There through the entrance, a voice crackled over the phone from Georgios's position. At least 20 of them. Hold them at the corridor, Eleni commanded, her voice surprisingly steady. Her fear was still there, a cold, hard knot inside her, but it was overshadowed by a razor-sharp clarity. The building was her text, and she was reading it aloud. Kale, they are concentrating on the main stairs. They will try to flank from the east wing. Are you in position? Ready, Kale's voice came back. Terse and strained. Now, Eleni said. From the east wing came a tremendous crash. Kale's team, hidden on a high shelf, had sent a massive, rolling oak map cabinet thundering down a flight of stairs, smashing into the advancing soldiers and blocking the passage completely. The element of surprise was theirs. The soldiers had expected to fight cornered rats in a single room, instead, they were fighting the building itself. The battle for the library became a brutal, intimate dance of strategy and violence. Eleni, the quiet archivist, became a battlefield commander. Her weapons were not bullets, but architecture and information. She guided her small force through the labyrinth, using her encyclopedic knowledge to anticipate the enemy's moves. The history section, 3rd floor, she'd command over the phone. The floorboards are weak near the windows. They won't support a machine gun. They're bringing in ladders to the 2nd floor windows on the west side, a spotter would report. The west wing is the old collection, Eleni would reply instantly. The shelves are packed tight. Tip them. Create a wall. She sent her fighters through service corridors they never knew existed, had them appear on balconies the soldiers thought were unreachable. She used the library's strange acoustics to her advantage, having one man shout from the north end of the dome to draw fire while her real force moved in from the south. She was a ghost in the machine, her quiet voice on the telephone a thread of order in the maelstrom of violence. Nikos, his leg still not healed enough for him to fight, was by her side, relaying messages, his face a mixture of pain, pride, and astonishment. You see, he murmured as they heard another shout of surprise from the soldiers below. A new text. But Stratos was relentless. After the first wave was repulsed, bloody and confused, he changed tactics. There was a pause. Then a new, terrifying sound, the metallic clang of canisters being unloaded from a truck. Gas. Georgios's panicked voice crackled over the phone. No, Eleni said, her blood running cold as she peered through a slit in the window. Worse. The soldiers were equipped with hoses and nozzles. Incendiaries. Stratos was done trying to take the library. He was simply going to burn it. The first jet of liquid fire arced through the broken doorway, splashing against a marble pillar. It ignited with a hungry whoosh. The fire had begun. The fire was an entity of its own. It devoured the dry paper and ancient wood with a terrifying speed, roaring like a beast uncaged. Black smoke, thick and choking, began to billow through the halls, carrying the smell of burning history. The defenders were forced to fall back from the lower levels, the heat becoming unbearable. The beautiful, ordered world Eleni had known her entire life was being consumed, turned to ash and smoke before her eyes. We have to pull back to the top floor. Kale yelled over the phone, his voice hoarse from shouting and smoke. We're being cooked alive down here. No, Eleni said, her voice strained. Her eyes were fixed on the fire consuming the shelves of the poetry section. The works of Sappho and Pindar and Cavafy turning to glowing embers. A part of her soul was burning with them. For a moment, despair seized her. Her fortress was becoming her crematorium. It was over. All her cleverness, her knowledge, had only delayed the inevitable. She had led these people into a trap from which there was no escape. Eleni. It was Nikos, his hands gripping her shoulders, forcing her to look away from the flames. His face was streaked with soot, his eyes burning with a fierce intensity. Eleni, listen to me. You have not lost yet. You know this building. Is there anywhere the fire can't reach? Anywhere at all? His words cut through the fog of her despair. Anywhere the fire can't reach, her mind flew, sifting through layers of memory and blueprints. The archives were in the sub-basement, yes, but the smoke would be drawn down there. It would be a death trap. But what lay beneath the archives? The image came to her, sharp and clear. A memory from her childhood, when the old curator had taken her on a tour of the library's deepest secrets. He had shown her the old cistern, built in the Roman era, a vast, stone-lined cavern deep beneath the foundations, designed to collect rainwater. It had been dry for centuries, a forgotten void beneath the library. And there was only one access point, a small, iron door hidden behind a fake shelving unit in the deepest part of the archives. The cistern, she breathed. There's a Roman cistern beneath the sub-basement. Can we get everyone there? Nikos asked. Yes, she said, her mind working again, the gears clicking back into place. But it's not enough. It's an escape. It's not a victory. Stratos will still be here when we emerge. If we emerge. Then we need more, Nikos pressed. Something to stop him. Something to break the siege. And then, another memory surfaced, connected to the first. The old curator complaining about the 1920s renovation. How the new steam heating system had been recklessly built right beside the cistern's main overflow duct. He had worried the constant heat and moisture would compromise the ancient Roman stonework. The heating system, the boilers. A new, terrifying, and brilliant idea began to form. An idea born of a child's memory, a scholar's knowledge, and a commander's desperation. Nikos, she said, her voice low and intense. Get everyone to the archives. Tell them to find the false shelf on the west wall, behind the municipal records. I will meet you there. But first I have to go to the boiler room. Nikos stared at her. The boiler room? Eleni, what are you planning? You said I needed to write a new text, she replied, a strange, grim smile touching her lips. I think I know what the final chapter is. The boiler room was a vision of hell. A cramped, iron-walled space, hot as a furnace from the fires above. The great, hulking boiler, silent for years, stood in the center like a malevolent iron god. Eleni knew from the schematics that its main pressure pipes were connected to the entire heating grid of the building, a web of iron that ran beneath the floors of the main halls. Her plan was insane. It was a scholar's wild guess based on half-remembered warnings and century-old engineering plans. But it was all she had left. While Kale and Georgios organized the retreat, fighting a desperate rearguard action against the encroaching flames and soldiers, Eleni worked in the suffocating heat of the boiler room. With her was Lefteris, the young partisan whose arm was now in a sling, his good hand surprisingly deft with tools. She was the brain, he was the hands. The main pressure release valve, she instructed, her voice echoing in the metallic space as she consulted a grease-stained schematic she'd brought with her. We need to seal it shut. Can you do that? Lefteris grunted, straining with a heavy wrench. It's rusted solid. But I think so. Her plan was a chain reaction of controlled destruction. The boiler still held a significant amount of water. If she could restart the furnace, the water would turn to steam. With the release valve sealed, the pressure inside the ancient, corroded pipes would build to a catastrophic level. The pipes ran directly beneath the main entrance hall, the very area where Stratos had concentrated his forces, using the grand portico as a field command post. The curator's old warning replayed in her mind, the steam system was dangerously close to the Roman cistern's overflow. A massive pipe rupture, beneath a floor already compromised by a century of settling. It was a gamble on forgotten history and flawed engineering. She worked with a feverish intensity, her fear burned away by adrenaline. She packed the furnace with flammable materials, old furniture, oil-soaked rags. As Lefteris finally gave a cry of triumph, the valve sealed, she knew there was no turning back. Go, she told him. Get to the cistern. Tell them I'm right behind you. He hesitated. And you? I have to light the fuse, she said simply. Alone in the roaring heat, she struck a match. The furnace ignited with a fierce roar, the flames casting her shadow, long and distorted, against the iron walls. She didn't wait to watch. She turned and fled, making her way through smoke-filled corridors toward the archives, the sound of the straining boiler a monstrous heartbeat behind her. She found them in the sub-basement, a huddled group of survivors, their faces black with soot. Kale had just managed to pry open the hidden iron door to the cistern. A gust of cold, ancient air washed over them. Eleni! Nikos cried, relief flooding his face as he saw her emerge from the smoke. Get in. How long? Kale demanded. I don't know, Eleni gasped, her lungs burning. Minutes. Maybe less. They scrambled into the darkness of the cistern, a vast, black space that swallowed their lantern light. Kale and Georgios were the last, staying by the door to help her through. Just as she was clambering over the threshold, the library above them gave a deep, groaning shudder. A low, powerful hum vibrated through the stone floor, growing rapidly into a deafening roar. Now! Kale yelled, pulling her inside as Georgios heaved the heavy iron door shut, plunging them into absolute darkness just as the world above them exploded. The sound was apocalyptic, a cataclysmic eruption of steam and shattering stone that they felt more than heard, a violent shockwave that threw them against the cistern walls. Then, silence. A profound, ringing silence, broken only by the sound of their own ragged breathing in the cold, black void. They had survived. But what had they survived into? They spent an eternity in the dark. It might have been hours, it might have been a day. Time had dissolved in the absolute blackness of the Roman cistern. The air was cold and still, carrying the scent of damp earth and stone. Above them, there was only silence. The battle, the fires, the explosion, all of it had ceased. The silence was more unnerving than the noise had been. It was the silence of a tomb, or of a city that had finally fallen. Eleni sat with her back against the cold, curved wall, listening to the breathing of the others around her. 20 souls huddled in the forgotten underbelly of Athens. She had gotten them here. She had saved them. But the cost was a gaping wound in her mind. She could still see the flames licking the spines of the poetry books, still smell the burning of irreplaceable manuscripts. She had used her knowledge to destroy a part of her own soul. Eventually, it was Kale who broke the stillness. "We can't stay here forever. We're out of water. Lefteris needs a real doctor." He and Georgios forced the heavy iron door open a crack. A faint, gray light filtered in, along with the smell of smoke and wet ash. Cautiously, they emerged from their stone womb back into the library's sub-basement. It was a wreck, choked with dust, but largely intact. As they ascended the stairs, the true scale of the devastation was revealed. The main entrance hall was gone. A massive, crater-like hole had opened up in the floor where the grand portico used to be. The explosion from the boiler and the ruptured steam pipes had collapsed the entire front section of the building. The grand staircase was a cascade of shattered marble. The fires had been extinguished, partly by the explosion and partly by the water from the burst pipes, leaving behind blackened walls and heaps of sodden, burned debris. The air was thick with the stench of a wet bonfire. But the library was still standing. The core of the building, the main stacks and the reading room, were damaged but not destroyed. It was a ruin, but it was their ruin. They looked out through the gaping hole where the doors had been. The street was a scene of chaos. Wrecked vehicles, shattered rubble. But there were no soldiers. No sign of Stratos's forces. In the distance, they could hear voices, but not the sounds of fighting. A strange, fragile calm had fallen over the city. A man in the uniform of a British officer, accompanied by 2 Greek government soldiers, saw them standing in the wreckage and approached cautiously, his weapon lowered. "My God," the British officer said, staring at the devastation. "We heard the explosion from across the city. What happened here?" Kale stepped forward. "We defended ourselves." The officer looked from Kale's rugged, partisan appearance to the small, soot-stained group behind him. "The fighting is over," he said. "A truce was signed this morning. Churchill himself is in Athens. There's a ceasefire." The ceasefire had been brokered hours ago. Eleni's final, desperate act hadn't just saved them, it had created a chaotic event so significant on the eve of a political truce that Stratos's entire operation was thrown into disarray. His unauthorized escalation and catastrophic failure to take the library had made him a political liability. As they later learned, Colonel Stratos was not dead. He had been away from his command post when the explosion hit. But his career was over. In a war where image and political capital were as important as bullets, he had been outmaneuvered and humiliated by a handful of insurgents led by a ghost in a library. He was quietly and permanently reassigned to a meaningless post on a distant island, a disgrace from which he would never recover. In the days that followed, the library became a strange sort of monument. A symbol of defiance in a city trying to stitch itself back together. Eleni remained, not leaving even when the others in Kale's group melted back into the city's network of resistance and reconciliation. She could not leave. This was her patient, and it was grievously wounded. She began the work of salvage. It was a heartbreaking task. With the help of a few returning library staff and volunteers from the university, she started sifting through the wreckage. For every volume she found miraculously intact, there were 10 that were burned beyond recognition or pulped by water. Each destroyed book was a physical pain, a silent accusation. Nikos stayed. His leg was still too weak for him to leave, but Eleni knew that was not the real reason. He sat for hours in the less damaged section of the reading room, watching her work. He helped where he could, sorting debris, his soldier's hand surprisingly gentle with the fragile, damaged pages. One afternoon, he found her in what was left of the poetry section, weeping silently as she held the charred remains of a first-edition Cavify. He didn't say anything. He simply sat beside her in the ruins, a quiet, solid presence in her grief. "I destroyed it," she whispered, her voice thick with tears. "To save it, I had to destroy it." "You saved the story, Eleni," Nikos said softly. "The building is stone and paper. The fire took that. But the story of what happened here, the story of the archivist who held off an army with maps and courage. You wrote that into the city's memory. That is a story that can't be burned." She looked at him, at his tired, kind eyes. He was right. The library was no longer just a repository of old stories. It had become a new one. And she was its author. A profound shift had occurred within her. The timid, anxious woman who feared the world outside these walls had commanded a battle, had made life and death decisions. Had faced down a tyrant and won. The fear was still there, a low hum beneath the surface, but it no longer owned her. It was just another book on the shelf of her soul, one she could acknowledge without having to read from it every day. Her work took on a new meaning. It was not just restoration, it was an act of defiance, of remembrance. Each repaired page was a testament to their survival. The citizens of Athens began to speak of her in low, reverent tones. The keeper, the woman who had protected the city's heart. One morning, weeks later, Cale returned. He was no longer in his partisan rags but in clean, civilian clothes. He looked different, older. He came with a group of officials from the new provisional government. Eleni Petridis, one of the officials said, a man with gray hair and weary eyes. The government wishes to formally recognize your courage. Colonel Stratos has been retired. The National Library is to be rebuilt. And we would be honored if you would oversee the project. As its chief director. Eleni stared at him, speechless. Chief director. It was a role of immense public responsibility, of committees and politics and speeches. Everything she had spent her life avoiding. Cale gave her a small, encouraging nod. She looked around the great, wounded reading room. She saw the empty spaces on the shelves, the scars on the marble. She saw the sunlight streaming through a broken patch in the glass dome, illuminating the swirling dust like a divine spotlight. This was her place. Her duty was no longer just to the past, but to the future. Yes, she said, her voice clear and steady. I accept. The story ends not with a grand ceremony, but with a quiet moment months later. The library is a hive of activity, the sounds of hammers and saws now replacing the sounds of war. Eleni walks through the familiar halls, no longer a ghost but a presence, a leader. She finds Nikos by a window, looking out over a city that is slowly, painfully, healing. And what will you do now, she asks him. Now that the fighting is done. I don't know, he admits. I was a student of law before all this. It seems a lifetime ago. He turns to her. Maybe I will stay. A library needs lawyers, I imagine. And this one needs guards who understand what it is they're truly protecting. Eleni smiles, a real, untroubled smile. She walks to a table where a salvaged book lies open. It is a simple book of folk tales, its cover stained but its pages intact. She runs her fingers over the printed words. She is no longer just the keeper of these stories. She is a part of them. The archivist who went to war, the woman who learned that the most powerful weapon in any library is the belief that some things are worth fighting for. She looks up, out at the light, and for the first time, her vision of the future is as clear and ordered as the most perfect catalogued system. She begins to read. Dynasty. Story 2. The first thing you noticed was the smell. Not the simple stench of filth that clung to every London alleyway, the familiar cocktail of human waste, rotting food, and the damp chill of the river, but a layered scent. Underneath the acrid bite of the tanneries curing vats next door, which she paid dearly to be near, was the sharp, clean perfume of cloves and the coppery tang of recent blood. This was the smell of her work. The smell of separation. Ilara dipped the forceps into the steaming water. The metal hissing softly. Her patient, a young weaver named Finn with eyes wide with terror, flinched at the sound. His breath was a foul cloud of rot and fear. Stay still, she murmured, her voice a low, steady thing that offered no false comfort. Falsehoods had no place here. The room was a sanctuary of brutal truths. The more you fight, the more it will resist. He whimpered, his knuckles white where he gripped the wooden stool. His jaw was a swollen, angry knot of red, the gum around the offending molar pulled back like a grimacing lip, revealing blackened decay. A classic case. The rot had eaten its way to the bone, and the body, in its blind wisdom, had walled it off with a pocket of pus. She took the tools from the water, her hands moving with a fluid economy that belied their strength. They were her father's hands in miniature. Slender and pale, but the palms were calloused, the fingertips stained brown from herbs. They were not a lady's hands. They were a craftsman's. "Open," she commanded. Finn obeyed, squeezing his eyes shut as if that could block the pain to come. Elara ignored his fear. To acknowledge it was to give it power. She worked with what was real, the bone, the nerve, the stubborn root. She positioned the forceps, feeling for the precise point of purchase. Her father's journal, its pages filled with elegant, spidery script and diagrams that would look like devil work to the uninitiated, had taught her this. "The tooth is a fortress," he had written in his coded Latin, but every fortress has a weak point. "Do not assault the walls. Find the gate." She found it. A slight give, a subtle shift in the root's anchor. She locked the forceps, took a deep breath that smelled of lye and cloves, and twisted. It was not a clean pull. It never was. There was a sickening crack, not of the tooth yielding, but of it shattering. Finn screamed, a high, thin sound that was swallowed by the thick stone walls of the room. Elara did not flinch. This was the second stage, the excavation. She set aside the forceps and picked up a slender, spoon-like instrument of her own design. "Breathe," she ordered, her voice sharp. "Breathe or you will choke on it." She worked quickly, scraping, digging, separating fragments of dead tooth from living, bleeding gum. The room filled with the sounds of wet tearing and Finn's ragged, sobbing breaths. Finally, she tweezed out the last, jagged piece of root, holding it up in the candlelight for a moment. It was a foul, corrupted thing, the cause of so much misery. She dropped it into a clay pot with a dull clink. It joined dozens of others. She packed the bleeding socket with a paste of yarrow and myrrh, its bitter, earthy scent momentarily overpowering the rot. "Bite down on this," she said, placing a wad of clean linen in his mouth. "Do not eat on this side for 2 days. Rinse with salted water. The swelling will go down. The pain is already leaving you." Finn looked at her, his face pale and slick with sweat, tears tracking clean paths through the grime on his cheeks. He fumbled in his pocket and produced a single, thin silver coin, placing it on the table with a trembling hand. "God bless you, mistress," he whispered through the linen. "God has nothing to do with this," Elara replied, turning to clean her tools. "Go. And speak of this to no one." He needed no second telling. The weaver scrambled out into the Southwark alley, leaving Elara alone with the echoes of his pain and the single silver coin. It was not much, but it was enough for bread for the week. That night, she sat by the faint light of a tallow candle, her father's journal open before her. It was her Bible and her curse. Within its leather-bound pages was a world of knowledge that defied the teachings of the guild surgeons with their clumsy saws and their belief in balancing the humors. Her father had been a physician, an alchemist, a man who believed the body was a machine of divine complexity, not a sack of mysterious fluids. He had drawn the paths of nerves, the architecture of bone, the flow of blood. For his curiosity, for believing what he saw over what he was told, he had been branded a heretic and cast out of the city. He had died in exile, leaving her with only this book and a set of tools forged from his own designs. "Knowledge is a lonely burden," the final entry read. "They fear what they do not understand, and they will burn what they fear. Be as the mouse, my Elara. Live in the walls. Be silent. Endure. A frantic pounding on her door shattered the quiet. Her heart seized. It was too late for patience. This was the sound of trouble. She quickly hid the journal under a loose floorboard before lifting the bar. A man stood in the doorway, his fine woolen cloak marking him as a man of means, his face a mask of panic. "Are you the woman?" he gasped, his eyes darting down the dark alley. "The one they whisper about. The one who can help." Ilara's face remained a careful blank. "I am a tanner's daughter," she said coolly. "You have the wrong door." "No," he insisted, stepping inside and barring the door behind him. He smelled of wealth, of clean wool and perfumed soap, but beneath it was the same scent she knew so well. The scent of desperation. "My master's wife, she is dying. Her jaw is swollen like a melon, her fever rages. Master Thomas of the guild came. He bled her, gave her poultices. He said only prayers could help her now." He pressed a heavy coin into her hand. "Gold. My master says prayers are not enough. He will pay anything." Ilara looked at the gold coin gleaming in her palm. It was more than she made in a month. It could buy safety, food, a new life. It could also buy her a death sentence. To treat the wife of a wealthy merchant was to step out of the shadows. Master Thomas would hear of it. The guild would not suffer an unlicensed woman to succeed where they had failed. She thought of her father's last words. "Be as the mouse," but the mouse was starving. "Tell me where she is," Ilara said, her voice betraying nothing. The gold coin felt cold and heavy in her hand, like a key to a door she knew she should not open. The merchant's house was a fortress of timber and stone in the heart of London proper, a world away from the squalor of Southwark. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of beeswax and lavender, a futile attempt to mask the cloying sweetness of the sick room. The merchant's wife, Lady Annalise, lay on a bed of fine linen, her face distorted into a monstrous parody. One side was swollen and purple, her eye forced shut, her lips pulled back from her teeth in a silent snarl of agony. Her breath came in shallow, feverish rasps. The merchant, a stout man named William whose face was etched with sleepless worry, wrung his hands. Master Thomas said it was a corruption of the blood. He let 2 pints this morning, but the fever only worsened. Ilara leaned closer, ignoring the man's commentary. She gently touched the swollen flesh. It was hot as a smith's forge and hard as oak. An abscess, a massive one, had formed deep in the jaw, and the poison was now flooding the woman's body. Bleeding her was like trying to empty a flooding ship with a teacup. "I need boiling water, clean linen, and all the light you can provide," she said, her voice cutting through the hushed panic of the room. She began unrolling her leather tool pouch on a nearby table. The strange shapes of her father's instruments, slender hooks, curved blades, polished metal probes, gleamed in the candlelight. William stared at the tools. What are you going to do?" "What your guild surgeon should have done," Ilara replied, not looking at him. "I am going to open the gate and let the poison out." For the next hour, the room became her workshop. She had William and a sturdy servant hold Annalise down. The woman, delirious with fever, thrashed weakly. Ilara worked with a terrifying focus, her face a mask of concentration. She found the softest point on the swelling inside the woman's cheek, took a deep breath, and made a swift, deep incision with a small, razor-sharp lancet. The release was immediate and grotesque. A torrent of thick, yellow-green pus and dark, foul-smelling blood erupted from the wound, flooding the woman's mouth. The servant gagged and turned away. William cried out in horror. Ilara was unmoved. She worked quickly, pressing on the jaw to expel the corruption, wiping the filth away with linen cloths. The stench was overwhelming, the primal smell of death being cheated. With the pressure relieved, she could now see the source, a molar so decayed it had crumbled into the jaw, leaving behind infected shards of root that had festered for months, perhaps years. The excavation was a delicate, bloody business, a mirror of her work on the weaver, but the stakes were infinitely higher. Here, failure meant more than a lost patient, it meant her own life. Finally, it was done. The last fragment was out. She packed the gaping wound with her strongest antiseptic herbs and laid a cool, damp cloth on the woman's forehead. Annalise's breathing was already deeper, less strained. The tautness had gone out of her face, leaving behind a slack, bruised exhaustion. "The fever will break by morning," Elara said, cleaning her tools with methodical precision. "Keep her warm. Give her only broth. I will return in 2 days to check the wound." William stared at her, his face a mixture of awe and revulsion. He led her to the door and pressed a heavy purse of coins into her hand. "I don't know what sorcery this is," he whispered, "but you have saved her. No one must know you were here." "No one." Elara nodded, pulling her cloak tight. "Your secret is as safe as my own life." But secrets in London had a short life. Within a week, whispers slithered through the markets and taverns. Lady Annalise, who had been at death's door, was now sitting up and taking soup. Master Thomas the surgeon's failure, and her miraculous recovery, became a delicious piece of gossip. It reached Thomas himself at his shop on Fleet Street, the red and white pole outside a proud declaration of his guild status. He was a thick-set man with a florid face and an air of unshakable authority. To hear that some back-alley charlatan had succeeded where he had failed was an intolerable insult to his craft and his pride. He began to ask questions, his inquiries sharp and pointed. The trail of whispers, faint as it was, eventually led across the bridge to Southwark, and to a woman who lived in the shadow of a tannery. The whispers also reached the cold stone walls of a Dominican priory, where Brother Simon sat transcribing a manuscript. Simon was a man who saw the world as a battlefield between God and Satan, and he was one of God's most vigilant soldiers. He heard the tale of Lady Annalise's recovery not as a story of healing, but as a story of unnatural intervention. Miracles came from God, through prayer and the hands of his anointed. A cure that came from a nameless woman in a disreputable part of the city, one that involved knives and bloodletting outside of sanctioned practice, could only be the work of the other side. His eyes, the color of a winter sky, grew colder still. He, too, began to ask questions, his inquiries soft as a serpent's hiss. Elara felt the shift in the air. A new tension hummed beneath the city's constant noise. Patients who came to her now looked over their shoulders. A stall-keeper in the market who had once sold her herbs suddenly claimed to have none. She was being watched. Her paranoia was given a face one afternoon when she was buying bread. A large man blocked her path. It was Thomas, his guild medallion gleaming on his chest. "I hear you have a deft hand with a troublesome tooth, mistress," he said, his voice dripping with condescending menace. "Pity you didn't see fit to join the guild." "Oh, but I forget. We do not admit women." "I am a tanner's daughter," Elara said, her voice flat. "I know nothing of your trade." "Don't you?" Thomas sneered, leaning closer. "Lady Annalise seems to think otherwise. A word of advice. Stick to tanning hides. The human body is guild work. Complications can arise. And when they do, there is no one to protect those who work in the shadows." He strode away, leaving Elara with a cold knot of fear in her stomach. He was threatening her. He was also warning her. The warning became a prophecy a month later. A man was brought to her, a captain of the city watch named Sir Callan, a bear of a man who had taken a mace to the face in a street brawl. His jaw was shattered, his teeth a mess of broken shards. The guild surgeons had refused him, saying the jaw was too damaged to set and he would be lucky to live, let alone eat solid food again. Callan's men, loyal and desperate, had heard the whispers about her. They brought him to her under the cover of night. It was the most complex work she had ever attempted. Using her father's diagrams of bone structure, she spent hours carefully removing the broken teeth, wiring his jaw shut with fine silver wire, and setting the fractured bone. It was agonizing, bloody work. Callan, a man who had faced down armed mobs, passed out twice from the pain. But when it was done, the jaw was set. Weeks later, a healed but scarred Callan returned. He did not speak a word of thanks. He simply looked at her with a quiet, appraising intensity, placed a single, perfect gold noble on her table, and left. The coin was a payment, but the look in his eyes was something more, an acknowledgement. A debt. Her success with the captain, however, only fanned the flames of suspicion. A woman who could mend a shattered jaw was no mere tooth-puller. She was something more. Something unnatural. Brother Simon now had a name and a location. He began his holy work in earnest. He spoke to Ilara's neighbors, his voice a gentle caress of poison, planting seeds of doubt. He spoke to the family of the weaver she had treated, asking if the boy had suffered nightmares. If Ilara had muttered strange words during the procedure. He spoke to the servants at the merchant's house, his questions circling the nature of the sorcery that had saved their mistress. He was building a web of fear and hearsay, and Ilara was the fly at its center. The final piece of his puzzle fell into place on a cold, rain-swept evening. An elderly woman, a fishwife named Agnes, was brought to her, suffering from a familiar swelling. Ilara knew from the moment she saw her that the rot was too deep, the woman's body too frail. The poison had already won. "I can ease her pain," Ilara told the woman's worried son. "I can drain the swelling. But her heart is weak. Her body may not survive the shock. The choice is yours. Do it," the son begged, his eyes filled with tears. "She cannot bear this pain." Ilara did her work. She drained the abscess, and for a few hours, the old woman seemed to rally, breathing easier. But as Ilara had feared, her weak heart gave out before dawn. She died peacefully in her sleep. It was a common, tragic end. But to Brother Simon, it was a gift from God. He now had what he had been waiting for. Not just whispers and rumors, but a body. A victim. The arrest came 2 days later. It was not a quiet affair. Guards, led by a grimly triumphant Brother Simon, stormed her small room in the middle of the day. They dragged her out into the muddy alley, ignoring her protests. Simon himself found the journal under the floorboards, holding it up for the gathered crowd of onlookers to see. "Behold," he cried, his voice ringing with righteous fury. "The witch's grimoire. The book of shadows from which she draws her dark power." He flipped through the pages, showing the crowd her father's detailed anatomical drawings. To their frightened, uneducated eyes, the sketches of skulls, nerves, and muscles were not science. They were proof of a demonic pact. They dragged her through the streets, the crowd jeering and throwing refuse. Women crossed themselves, men spat at her feet. She saw Thomas the surgeon watching from the edge of the crowd, his face a mask of grim satisfaction. And as they hauled her towards the priory, she caught the eye of Sir Calin, the captain of the watch, standing silently among his men. His face was unreadable, but his eyes held hers for a long moment before she was pulled away. The debt, she thought with a surge of bitter despair, had been a figment of her imagination. In the face of the church, all other loyalties dissolved. She was alone. The trial was a formality, a piece of theater staged to confirm a foregone conclusion. It was held in a high-ceilinged hall of the priory, the air cold and damp, smelling of old stone and incense. Ilara stood on a raised platform, her hands bound, facing a tribunal of 3 stern-faced Dominican friars. Brother Simon stood before them, acting as prosecutor, his voice a calm, reasonable instrument of condemnation. He began by calling the family of Agnes, the fishwife. The son, weeping, told the court how his mother had been alive until this woman had laid her hands on her. He described the strange tools, the bitter-smelling herbs. "She did not pray," the son cried, pointing a trembling finger at Ilara. "She muttered and cut. She is a witch, and she murdered my mother." Simon then called a string of other witnesses, neighbors who spoke of strange smells and late-night visitors. A frightened boy who claimed her touch was cold as the grave. It was a tapestry woven from fear and superstition. Finally, he produced the journal. "And here, my brothers, is the source of her power," he said, laying the book on the table. Not the Holy Bible, but a book of filth and blasphemy. A catalogue of the devil's own architecture. He opened it to a detailed drawing of the human skull, the jaw hinged open to show the teeth. A gasp went through the room. She consorts with the dead. She cuts them open to learn their secrets, a practice forbidden by God and man. She uses this profane knowledge to work her cures, which are not cures at all, but snares for the soul. When it was her turn to speak, Ilara's voice was steady, though her heart hammered against her ribs. She tried to explain. "It is not sorcery," she said, her voice echoing in the silent hall. "It is knowledge. The body is not a mystery. It has rules. The swelling is caused by poison, the poison by rot. If you remove the rot and release the poison, the body can heal itself. The drawings are not demonic. They are a map. A map of us." One of the friars scoffed. "A map? Woman, you speak heresy. The body is God's temple, its workings a sacred mystery known only to Him. Then God is a poor architect to allow His temples to crumble from within," Ilara retorted. A spark of her father's defiance flashing in her eyes. The words were a mistake the moment they left her lips. A collective hiss of shock came from the onlookers. She had just insulted God Himself. Brother Simon smiled, a thin, cruel curving of his lips. He had her. "She blasphemes," he said softly. "Her arrogance knows no bounds." He then called his final witness. Master Thomas of the Barber Surgeons Guild. Thomas walked to the stand. A solid, confident figure in the oppressive silence. He was the voice of legitimacy, of sanctioned knowledge. His testimony would be the final nail in her coffin. He avoided looking at Ilara. "Master Thomas," Simon began, his voice smooth as oil. "You are an expert in the humors of the body, are you not? You have treated many an ailment of the mouth and jaw." "I have," Thomas said, his voice booming with self-importance. "For 20 years, as a master of my guild." "And have you ever, in all your years of practice, seen cures like those attributed to this woman? A jaw swollen like a melon, healed in a day. A knight's face, shattered by a mace, made whole again." Thomas hesitated. This was the moment. He could destroy her with a single word. He could call her a fraud, a charlatan, her work nothing but luck and devilry. It would be the safe, expected answer. But he was also a craftsman. He had seen Lady Annalise after Ilara had treated her. He had seen the clean wound, the drained poison. He had seen Sir Caelan's jaw, the bones set with a precision he knew, in his heart, he could not have matched. His professional jealousy warred with a craftsman's grudging respect. He finally spoke, his eyes fixed on the stone floor. "Her methods are not our methods," he said slowly, choosing his words with care. "They are irregular. The tools she uses, I have never seen their like. The speed of the healing is unnatural." He paused. "But I have seen her work. The incision on Lady Annalise was clean. Precise. The setting of Sir Caelan's bone, it showed a knowledge of anatomy that is, profound." A murmur went through the court. This was not the outright condemnation they expected. Brother Simon's eyes narrowed. "Profound, Master Thomas? Or profane?" he pressed. Thomas finally looked at Ilara, his expression a complex mixture of contempt and something that looked almost like awe. "It is not for me to say what is profane," he said, his voice dropping. "But I will say this. Such knowledge is not taught in any guild. And it is certainly not natural in a woman." And with that, he was done. He had not lied. He had told the truth, but a truth wrapped in the damning cloak of superstition. He had acknowledged her skill only to frame it as something otherworldly, something to be feared. It was a masterful betrayal, sealing her fate more surely than any lie could have. Brother Simon turned to the tribunal, his arms spread wide. "You hear him? A master of the craft admits her knowledge is unnatural. It is the devil's knowledge, gifted to his servant. The head friar, his face a grim slab of piety, nodded slowly. He did not need to confer with his brothers. The verdict was written on his face before he even spoke the words. Ilara of Southwark, he intoned, his voice devoid of any emotion. This court finds you guilty of the crime of witchcraft. You have used profane knowledge to meddle in the affairs of God, leading to the death of the pious Agnes and the ensnaring of other souls through your unnatural cures. He made the sign of the cross. Your sentence is to be delivered unto the river, that your unholy fire may be quenched by the water. You will be drowned at dawn, 2 days hence. May God have mercy on your corrupted soul. The words washed over Ilara, cold and final. She felt a strange calm settle over her. The fear was gone, replaced by a hollow, ringing silence. She looked out at the sea of faces, hateful, fearful, righteous. She saw her father's last words, written in candlelight, "They will burn what they fear, he had been wrong. They would drown it." As the guards pulled her away, her eyes met Brother Simon's one last time. His face was serene, filled with the placid glow of a man who believes he has done a great and holy thing. He had scoured the filth from God's city. He had won. She was taken to the tower, that great stone beast on the riverbank, and thrown into a cell. The door, thick oak bound with iron, boomed shut, the sound of a tomb being sealed. The cell was small, damp, and smelled of despair and wet stone. A single, high slit of a window showed a sliver of grey, indifferent sky. This was the end. Her father's knowledge, his art, would die with her. The journal would be burned as a heretical text. The tools would be melted down. All that he was, all that she had tried to be, would be erased. She curled up on the thin straw pallet, the cold of the floor seeping into her bones, and for the first time since she was a child, Ilara wept. She wept not for her life, but for the knowledge that would be lost, for the countless others who would continue to suffer and die from the rot. Their pain answered only by prayers and clumsy butchery. She spent the next day and a half in that state of numb despair. The sounds of the city, the distant clang of a blacksmith's hammer, the cries of boatmen on the river, the ringing of church bells, were a torment, a reminder of a world that would go on without her, a world that had condemned her for trying to heal it. On the night before her scheduled drowning, she was staring at the sliver of night sky when she heard a faint sound at her cell door. Not the heavy tread of the usual guards, but a softer, more deliberate footstep. There was a metallic scraping sound, the jingle of a key, and then a soft thud. Her heart pounded. Was it Simon, come to offer her a final chance at confession? The footsteps receded. Silence returned. Ilara waited, her body tense. Nothing. Cautiously, she rose and went to the door. She pushed. It swung inward with a low groan. It was unlocked. For a moment, she stood frozen, unable to comprehend it. A trap. A test of her faith. Then she heard it. A commotion from the far side of the tower grounds. Shouts. The frantic ringing of an alarm bell. And through her high window, she saw a flicker of orange light dancing against the stone walls. Fire. A diversion. Her mind raced. Who? Why? Then she remembered the look in his eyes. The silent acknowledgement. The debt. Sir Callan. The captain of the watch. A man whose word was law in the city's streets, a man who commanded the loyalty of the very guards who held her captive. He had not spoken at her trial. He had not tried to intervene. That would have been suicide. Instead, he had waited. And he had acted. Not with a dramatic rescue, but with a key, a quiet footstep, and a well-placed fire. There was no time for gratitude or disbelief. Survival, a primal instinct she thought had been extinguished, surged through her. She slipped out of the cell and into the darkened corridor. The tower was in chaos, guards running towards the fire, their shouts echoing down the stone passageways. She moved like a shadow, keeping to the walls, her bare feet silent on the cold floor. She knew she could not simply run. They would hunt her. She needed her tools. She needed the journal. Without them, she was nothing. Her escape from the tower was a blur of fear and instinct. She used the chaos, melting into the shadows, moving with the stream of panicked servants and stable hands away from the fire. Once outside the tower's main gate, she did not run towards the bridge, towards freedom. She ran back into the city, towards the one place they would not think to look for her immediately, her own ransacked room in Southwark. The journey through the nighttime streets of London was a nightmare. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat, every drunken shout sent a jolt of fear through her. She was a ghost in her own city, a condemned soul moving through a world that thought her safely locked away. She pulled her rough prison tunic tighter, hiding her face, praying she was anonymous enough to pass unnoticed. Her room was a scene of violation. The door hung from a single hinge. Her meager possessions were strewn across the floor, her herbs scattered, her pots smashed. The guards, in their search for evidence, had been thorough in their destruction. She knelt, her hands shaking, and felt for the loose floorboard under her pallet. It was still there. With a surge of desperate hope, she pried it up. They had missed it. The journal, her father's soul bound in leather, was untouched. They had been looking for potions and cursed objects, and had discarded the book of scribbles as worthless. She clutched it to her chest, the worn leather a familiar comfort against her skin. Next to it was the small leather roll containing her most essential tools, the lancet, the excavator, the fine silver wire. They had missed those, too. She had what she needed. Now, she had to disappear. The Thames. The river that was meant to be her grave would be her escape. She made her way down to the wharves, the air thick with the smell of fish, tar, and river mud. The fire at the tower was still a distant glow in the sky, and the docks were busy with activity, boatmen calling out, loading and unloading cargo by torchlight. Here, in the chaos of commerce, a single, cloaked figure could go unnoticed. She saw a garbage barge, low in the water, being loaded with the city's refuse. It was a foul, stinking vessel, but it was heading downriver, away from the city. She waited for the watchman to turn his back, then slipped aboard, hiding herself amongst sacks of rotting vegetables and animal bones. The stench was sickening, but it was the smell of escape. As the barge was pulled out into the current, Elara looked back at London. The tower stood silhouetted against the firelight, a grim monument to the city's fear. The great spire of St. Paul's pointed to a heaven that had offered her no protection. She was leaving it all behind. Her home, her name, the few fragile connections she had made. She was an exile, just as her father had been. The barge drifted slowly down the dark, swirling river. The sounds of the city faded, replaced by the rhythmic slap of water against the hull and the lonely cry of a night bird. She was adrift, in every sense of the word. Dawn found the barge miles downriver, approaching the marshy flatlands of the estuary. The sky was a pale, wounded gray. Elara slipped off the barge as it neared the shore, wading through the cold, muddy water to land. She stood on a lonely stretch of shoreline, shivering, soaked, and utterly alone. She looked down at her hands. They were caked with the filth of the river, but underneath, she could still see the stains of her work. She opened the journal. The ink had not run. The diagrams were still clear. Her father's knowledge was safe. She had no name. She had no home. She had no destination. All she had was a pouch of strange tools and a book of forbidden knowledge. She was a fugitive, a heretic, a ghost. But she was alive. And somewhere, in some village or town ahead, there would be a person with a swollen jaw, a desperate family, and a pain that prayers could not cure. The rot was everywhere. The work was endless. She turned her back to the river and began to walk, her small figure a solitary silhouette against the vast, indifferent landscape. She did not know where she was going. She only knew she had to keep moving. The mouse, her father had told her. Live in the walls. Be silent. Endure. She was no longer just a healer, an artist of separation. She was now the keeper of a dangerous, flickering flame in a world determined to extinguish it. And as she walked, the rising sun cast her shadow long on the road ahead, a shadow that carried the weight of all the pain she had eased, and all the suffering yet to come. Dynasty. Story 3. The first rule of survival at Castle Blackwood was that the laughter must never stop. Especially when you wanted to scream. The great hall roared, a beast made of 100 drunken throats, its breath hot with the smell of roasted boar and spilled wine. Torches spat and hissed in their iron sconces, casting flickering, monstrous shadows that danced with the fools. And tonight, as on every night for the past 2 years, the greatest fool was Pip. She landed in a clumsy somersault, the bells on her motley tunic and curled shoes chiming a discordant song of forced merriment. A wave of laughter, sharp and cruel, washed over her. She rose with a grin plastered on her face. A mask of idiocy that had taken years to perfect. It was a good mask. It had to be. Beneath it, Philippa Beaumont was suffocating. Another, fool, bellowed a thick-necked baron, his face flushed with mead. Show us how Lord Ancroft trips over his own sword. Pip bowed low, the floppy points of her coxcomb hat brushing the greasy rushes on the floor. As you wish, my lord, she chirped, her voice pitched a little higher. A little more witless than her own. But to imitate a man of such gravitational challenges, I would first need to consume 3 more pies. Another roar, this one appreciative. The joke landed squarely, mocking Baron Stenbridge's own considerable girth while seeming to aim at a rival. It was a delicate dance, this tightrope walk over the egos of powerful men. One misstep, one joke that cut a whisper too deep, and the fall wasn't into a safety net. It was into a dungeon. Her eyes, gray and sharp, flickered across the high table. They skimmed past the bored ladies, the braying knights, and settled, as they always did, on him. Lord Valerius Blackwood. He wasn't laughing. He rarely did. He watched, his chin resting on a closed fist, a small, knowing smile playing on his lips. He was a handsome man, with hair the color of spun gold and eyes the blue of a winter sky. But there was a coldness there, a predator's stillness that chilled the air around him. He enjoyed Pip's wit not as a simple pleasure, but as an intellectual curiosity, like a man admiring the intricate workings of a trap. It was his gaze, more than any threat of the whip, that terrified her. Because sometimes, she felt he could see straight through the bells and the bright, clashing colors. She felt he could see the girl hiding inside the fool. Standing near the wall, a pillar of silent judgment, was the other man who watched her. Sir Callan, captain of the guard. A mountain of a man, grey-bearded and grim, his face a roadmap of old battles. His gaze wasn't curious, it was appraising, heavy, and constant. He watched her not as a fool, but as a discrepancy, a puzzle he hadn't yet solved. Every time his eyes met hers, Pip's heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. A frantic counterpoint to the jester's song. She launched into her imitation, her nimble body twisting into a parody of a pompous, clumsy nobleman. The hall shook with laughter. She smiled, she bowed, she jingled. And inside, she counted. 5 years. 5 years since the fires. 5 years since her father's name, Beaumont, had been erased from the world, replaced with the word traitor. Later, in the cold solitude of her garret room, a space barely larger than a broom closet, tucked away behind the kitchens, the mask came off. Pip ceased to exist. Philippa emerged, her face stark and pale and the sliver of moonlight slanting through a grimy arrow slit. She touched the faint, silvery line on her lower lip. A gift from a falling, burning roof beam. The only physical thing she had left of that night. Her reflection in a shard of polished steel was a stranger's. The cropped black hair. The lean, wiry frame honed by years on the run and performing acrobatics, it was a boy's image, a fool's image. But the eyes were her father's. Eyes that had once looked upon her with such love, now burned with a cold, patient fire. She unpacked her mind, laying out the evening's events like treasures on a threadbare blanket. Every word, every glance. Valerius's smile. Kalen's stare. The Baron's insult. They were pieces. All she needed was the one that fit, the one that would unlock the truth. The inciting moment came a week later, during the feast celebrating the anniversary of the Battle of Greyfen, the victory that had solidified Lord Valerius's power in the north. The wine flowed more freely than water, and with it, the tongues of men loosened. Valerius himself was in a rare, expansive mood. To victory, he toasted. His voice carrying easily over the din, and to the cleansing of the vipers from our midst. He was telling the story again. The story of the noble houses that had supposedly betrayed his father to his enemies. The story of the Beaumonts. Philippa stood near the high table, frozen behind her grin, a jester made of stone. They were clever, I'll grant them that, Valerius said, a cruel nostalgia in his voice. Lord Beaumont, especially. A man of letters and laws. But in the end, all his plotting was undone, by a simple flaw in a piece of metal. He chuckled, a low, rumbling sound. A family signet ring, you see. It had a hairline crack. When pressed into the wax of a treasonous letter, it left an imperceptible mark. A broken circle. Proof of a broken oath. The hall murmured. It was a dramatic detail. A storyteller's flourish. But to Philippa, the words were a physical blow. A broken signet ring. That was a detail no one outside the inner circle of the plot could possibly know. Her father's ring, the one he had worn every day of his life, had been flawless. It was a lie. A specific, calculated lie. And in that lie was the key. He knew. Valerius didn't just inherit the spoils of her family's destruction. He was its architect. The world seemed to tilt. The torchlight swam, the laughter faded to a distant buzz. For a terrifying second, she felt her mask slip, the fool's grin faltering, her face contorting with a grief so raw, so pure, it would have been her death sentence. She bit down hard on her scarred lip, the sharp pain a welcome anchor. She forced the muscles of her face back into their familiar, idiotic shape. She picked up 3 fallen apples from the floor and began to juggle, her hands moving with a desperate, flawless precision. The laughter must never stop. Especially now. Because now, she wasn't just surviving. She was hunting. And she knew, with chilling certainty, what she was hunting for. A letter sealed with a broken ring. A lie pressed into wax. Proof. And it was here, somewhere within the cold stone walls of Castle Blackwood. The castle, once her prison, was now her hunting ground. Every shadow held a secret, every locked door a possibility. Her life as Pip, the transparent fool everyone saw but no one noticed, became her greatest weapon. But the castle guarded its secrets well. The most vital of them, she knew, would be kept in the one place a fool had no business being, the Lord's private library. The library was the domain of Maester Elric. A man whose spine was as rigid as the shelves he tended and whose love for silence was matched only by his disdain for jesters. Getting the key from him was a frontal assault she could not win. Subtlety was required. One afternoon, when Elric was meticulously cataloguing new manuscripts in the scriptorium adjacent to the library, Pip struck. She didn't sneak. She burst in, a whirlwind of color and noise, chasing a rogue chicken she had borrowed from the kitchens. "Apologies, Maester," she yelped, tumbling over a stool and sending a stack of parchment flying. "This feathered fiend has a thirst for knowledge. Or perhaps it merely wishes to critique your penmanship." Elric's face turned a shade of plum. As he shrieked at her, flustered and furious, trying to shoo both her and the clucking chicken out, Pip's nimble fingers, hidden by the chaos of her fall, deftly lifted the heavy iron key from the hook on his belt, pressed it into a lump of soft wax she had palmed, and returned it in the space of a single, frantic heartbeat. Out! Out, you painted menace, he screeched. As you wish. Pip cried, scooping up the chicken. This place is too quiet anyway. It dulls the wit. She scampered out, leaving an apoplectic maester and a few scattered feathers in her wake. That night, clutching a freshly cut key made by the castle blacksmith in exchange for a scandalous song about his rival, she approached the library. The lock turned with a groan that sounded as loud as a scream in the sleeping castle. The air inside was cool and smelled of aged paper, leather, and dust, the scent of buried words. Moonlight streamed through the high-arched windows, illuminating towers of books that rose like silent, sleeping giants. For a moment, Philippa felt a pang of longing. This was her father's world. She could almost see him here, his head bent over a tome, a quiet smile on his face. The feeling vanished, replaced by cold resolve. She moved silently, a ghost in motley, her eyes scanning the shelves. Where would Valerius hide such a thing? Not in plain sight. It had to be somewhere personal, somewhere meaningful only to him. She searched his private desk, prying at false bottoms, tapping panels for hollow sounds. Nothing. Hours bled away, the moon arcing across the sky, until the first hint of dawn threatened the eastern horizon. She left with nothing but the dust of failure on her hands. Her nightly excursions did not go unnoticed. A few days later, as she practiced juggling in a secluded courtyard, a shadow fell over her. You keep late hours, fool. It was Sir Calin. He stood with his arms crossed, his presence blotting out the sun. His voice was a low rumble, devoid of accusation but heavy with meaning. The best jokes are born in the moonlight, Sir Captain, Pip said, not missing a beat, her hands a blur. The sun is too honest for true comedy. Is that what you were seeking in the West Wing? Honesty? He asked. His eyes narrowed. The library is a long way from your chambers. Her heart froze. She let one of the balls drop, a calculated fumble. Ah, you found me out. I confess, I was searching for a rhyme for Valerius. So far, the best I have is glorious, but that feels a bit sycophantic, even for me. Calin didn't smile. A fool's curiosity can be as fatal as a lord's ambition. There are books in that library that do not tell jokes. Remember that. He turned and walked away, leaving her with a racing pulse and the unnerving feeling of being understood. He had warned her. Why? The psychological pressure mounted. Lord Valerius, as if sensing her desperation, began to summon her more frequently to his private solar. These were not commands to perform, but to talk. He would pour himself wine, gesture for her to sit on a stool at his feet, and simply watch her, a smirk playing on his lips. Tell me, Pip, he said one evening, swirling the dark red liquid in his goblet. You are a quick-witted thing. Quicker than most of my bannermen. Where does a fool learn such sharpness? From his betters, my lord, she replied, her gaze fixed on the floor. By listening to the wise words of men like yourself, and then doing the exact opposite. He laughed. A genuine, sharp bark of amusement. Clever. Too clever, perhaps. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. You have the eyes of a hawk, little fool. Not a dove. They see everything. What do they see when they look at me? It was a test. A trap laid in silk and wine. She had to answer. They see a great lord, Philippa said, her voice steady, the words tasting like ash. A lion whose roar is the law of the land. A lion, Valerius mused, leaning back. Yes. I like that. But even lions have jackals who nip at their heels. Be sure you remain a songbird, Pip. Not a jackal. The threat was clear. He was playing with her, enjoying the power he held over her every breath. She left the solar feeling flayed, her composure hanging by a thread. A breakthrough came from an unexpected source. In the kitchens, she overheard two guards, flush with ale, complaining about a cantankerous old soldier named Jory who was now a gatekeeper at the eastern postern. "Still talks about the old days," one grumbled. "Still boasts of being there when they strung up that traitor Beaumont. Says he saw the whole thing. A human target. It took her a week to get close to Jory. He was a sour, suspicious man. She brought him stolen pastries, listened to his boring stories, and made him the hero of bawdy songs. Finally, one rainy night, she steered the conversation. It must have been a grand sight," she said, feigning awe. "Seeing a great lord fall." Jory spat. "Grand? It was a butcher's work. Beaumont never even spoke in his own defense. Just stood there." He squinted, his memory stirring. "Funny thing, though. The Lord's clerk who read the charges, he had a tremor in his hand. Shook so much he almost dropped the scroll. And the seal on it. I remember thinking it looked odd. Chipped like. A chipped seal. A nervous clerk. More pieces. The clerk, a man named Lucius, had died of a fever a year after the execution. Convenient. But his records, his letters, they might still exist. They would be in the castle archives, a section of the library she hadn't dared to explore. That night, fueled by a new, desperate hope, she returned to the library. But she was reckless. The fear of Valerius and the proximity of the truth made her clumsy. As she was prying open a records chest, a floorboard creaked behind her. She spun around, a small dagger she kept hidden in her boot now in her hand. Sir Calin stood in the doorway, a lantern held aloft. His face was unreadable in the flickering light. This was it. It was over. He didn't call the guards. He simply looked at the dagger, then at her terrified face. He took a slow step into the room. "That's a nobleman's grip," he said, his voice quiet. "Not a jester's. Your footwork is sloppy, though. You're putting too much weight on your back leg. You'd be on the floor before you got a single strike in." Philippa stared, speechless. He knew. He didn't know who she was. But he knew what she wasn't. "Whoever you are," Calin continued, his voice low and urgent, "this is a foolish game. Valerius is not a man to be trifled with. He smells deceit like a wolf smells blood. Whatever you're looking for, it isn't worth your life. You don't know what it's worth," she whispered, her voice cracking, the sound of Philippa, not Pip. He held her gaze for a long moment, a silent battle of wills and wits passing between them. Then he sighed, a deep, weary sound. "The archives are watched. The chests are trapped. But the old maester's personal correspondence, he was a man who hated Valerius's father. He kept his own records. Look for the book with the heron clasp. And be gone before the morning." He turned and left, plunging her back into darkness, leaving her with a gift more precious and more dangerous than any key, a thread of trust in a world of lies. He had chosen a side. Or perhaps, he had simply chosen a person over the system. For Philippa, it was the first crack of light in 5 years of darkness. A terrifying, beautiful, and possibly fatal light. The news arrived on the wings of a lathered horse, its rider shouting of banners and marching men. Lord Elmsworth, Valerius's most bitter rival to the south, had moved his army. It wasn't war, not yet. But it was a challenge. A wave of paranoia, cold and swift, washed over Castle Blackwood. The great portcullis groaned shut. The gates were barred. No one was to enter or leave. The castle had become a sealed tomb. For Philippa, the news was a death knell. Her time had run out. Armed with Caelan's information, she knew she had one last chance, a final, desperate gamble before Valerius's tightening fist crushed everyone in its grip. That night, the castle hummed with a nervous energy. Guards clanked down corridors in pairs, their eyes sharp and suspicious. The air was thick with the metallic scent of fear. She found the book with the heron clasp tucked away in a dusty alcove of the maester's office, a room within the library she hadn't dared enter before. Her fingers, trembling, fumbled with the latch. Inside, the book was hollow. And nestled within the hollowed-out pages was a thin, leather-bound ledger. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She opened it. The spidery, precise script of the old clerk, Lucius, filled the pages. It was a private diary. And on the pages dated the week of her family's execution, the truth was laid bare. Lord V's father demanded a new seal be forged, one with a flaw. I was forced to witness the signing. The Duke of Ancroft was present, a promise of his lands in exchange for his silence, Lord Beaumont was innocent. We have murdered an honorable man. May God have mercy on my soul, It was all there. Names. Dates. The conspiracy, written in the hand of a guilty man. This was more than proof. It was a weapon. A floorboard creaked in the outer library. She shoved the ledger into the oilskin pouch hidden beneath her motley tunic just as the door to the office swung open. Lord Valerius stood there, flanked by 2 guards. He wasn't smiling. His handsome face was a mask of cold fury. I grow tired of games, Pip, he said, his voice dangerously soft. There is a viper in my castle. A spy. And my guards tell me my clever little fool has been asking too many questions, wandering too many halls. Your jokes have cut too close to the bone lately. Whose words are you truly speaking? He didn't know about the ledger. He didn't know who she was. This was a paranoid purge, and she was the first on his list. Only my own, my lord, she said, her mind racing. A fool's words are like the wind, they go where they please. This wind, Valerius hissed, blows from the south, I think. From Elmsworth. He nodded to the guards. Seize him. We'll see how well he jests with a hot poker to his feet. The guards moved forward. Philippa backed away, her hand instinctively going to the dagger in her boot. It was over. Halt. The voice was like the crack of a whip. Sir Callan stood in the doorway, his hand on the hilt of his great sword. He had come. Sir Callan, Valerius said, his eyes narrowing. This does not concern you. The fool is a spy. The boy is a fool, my lord. Nothing more, Callan said, stepping into the room. Placing himself between Pip and Valerius. He saw the bulge of the ledger under her tunic. He saw the terror and resolve in her eyes. And in that instant, he understood. He has been in this office. He has seen things, Valerius insisted. I will have the truth from him. Seize him, I said. Callan did not move. My lord, in these tense times, to harm a licensed fool, it is a sign of instability. Your men are nervous. Do not give them a reason to doubt your composure. It was a brilliant, desperate gambit. An appeal to Valerius's pride, his greatest weakness. For a second, it almost worked. Valerius hesitated. But then his gaze fell upon Philippa's hand, which was clenched white-knuckled around the hidden pouch. What are you hiding, fool? He whispered. The game was up. There was no more time for lies. Philippa met his gaze. And for the first time, she let the fool die. She let Philippa Beaumont look out from her eyes. She drew a deep breath. And she performed. It was her final, greatest show. Her voice, clear and strong, rang out in the silent library. It was not Pip's voice. It was the voice of a noblewoman. I will tell you a story, my lord. A fable for our troubled times. Valerius stared, momentarily stunned by the change in her. It is the story of a great wolf, she announced. Her eyes never leaving his, who coveted a sheep's pasture. But the shepherd was strong and loved by his flock. So the wolf forged a secret pact with a jealous fox. They planted a dead lamb in the shepherd's field, and the wolf howled that the shepherd was a butcher. And all the other animals, fearing the wolf's teeth, believed him. The guards shifted uncomfortably. This was no fable. The wolf took the pasture, she continued. Her voice rising with passion, and grew fat and powerful. But he kept a souvenir of his crime. The dead lamb's fleece, a testament to his lie. She pulled the ledger from her tunic, holding it aloft like a holy relic. He kept it to admire his own cleverness. But he forgot that truth, like the sun, will always find a way to rise. Treason. Valerius shrieked, his face contorted in a mask of pure rage. He lunged. It happened in a blur. Calin roared, drawing his sword, not to attack Pip, but to block Valerius's path. To me, he yelled to the guards, a command of pure, defiant chaos. The guards, confused, looked from their lord to their captain. That was the moment Philippa had been given. She didn't run. She acted. She threw a heavy, silver inkwell towards the far window, shattering it and drawing every eye. As heads turned, she shoved the precious ledger deep into Caelan's hands. For the north, she whispered. She scrambled onto the great oak desk, her jester's agility serving her one last time. She ran its length, a flash of color and desperation. Valerius, shaking off Caelan, turned back to her, his face a promise of a slow, agonizing death. With a final, desperate prayer to a god she no longer believed in, she leapt. Not for the door, but for the huge, stained-glass window depicting a long-dead saint. The glass exploded outwards in a shower of colored shards. For a breathtaking moment, she hung in the air, a broken angel in motley. Then she fell, down into the churning, black water of the river that ran beneath the castle walls. The last thing she saw was Sir Caelan, his sword raised, standing alone against his lord. A grim, final bastion in a world of lies. The last thing she heard was not laughter, but the sound of steel on steel. The river was a shock of icy violence. It pulled her down, the weight of her wet clothes a death shroud. But the instinct to live, the same feral instinct that had kept Philippa Beaumont alive for 5 years, was stronger. She fought her way to the surface, gasping, her lungs burning. The ledger was gone, entrusted to Caelan. Her mission was, in a sense, complete. But she was adrift, a piece of flotsam in the cold, indifferent darkness. She washed ashore a mile downstream, battered, bruised, and utterly alone. She lay on the muddy bank, shivering uncontrollably, and looked back at the distant silhouette of Castle Blackwood. It stood against the moonlit sky, a jagged tooth of stone and sorrow. It had been her prison, her stage, and the tomb of her family. Now, it was just a memory. A scar on the landscape, just like the one on her lip. Weeks bled into one another. The motley was burned, the bells silenced forever. In the smoky corner of a grimy tavern in a southern port town, a thin, quiet youth with haunted eyes listened more than they spoke. Philippa learned to be invisible in a different way, not with noise and color, but with silence and shadow. News traveled slowly, carried on the tongues of merchants and mercenaries. There was unrest in the north. Lord Valerius Blackwood's position was precarious. Rumors of a dead clerk's diary, of a sworn confession from a dying captain of the guard, were circulating, poisoning his name. His rival, Lord Elmsworth, was pressing his advantage. The system, that great, unthinking beast, had been wounded. The ledger had found its mark. But Valerius still ruled. The beast was not dead. Such things rarely died so easily. Sir Caelan, they said, had been executed for treason. He had bought her life with his own. The weight of that knowledge was a heavier burden than any costume. One grey morning, Philippa took the last of her coin and bought a sturdy, unremarkable horse. She had the truth. She had her revenge, or a bitter taste of it. The name Beaumont might one day be cleared in some dusty, official scroll. But the girl who had borne that name was gone. Pip, the fool, was also gone. As she rode out of the town, she didn't look back. There was nothing to look back to. Before her was the road, a ribbon of mud and uncertainty stretching into a horizon empty of promises. She was free from the castle, but she would forever be a prisoner of what she had done, and what had been done to her. She was a ghost, a story, a survivor who had forgotten the shape of her own face. The laughter had finally stopped. And in the profound, terrifying silence that remained, she wrote on. Done as T. Story 3. The rain fell on London not as a cleansing wash, but as a cold, greasy film. It slicked the cobblestones of the alley until they gleamed like polished bone under the sliver of a moon. And it turned the air thick with the stench of the Thames, of coal smoke and wet wool and something older, something like decay. It was a good night for ghosts, and Alara Vance was a good ghost. She pressed herself into the recess of a tanner's shop, the rough stone biting into her back through her thin cloak. The reek of lye and curing hides was a physical assault, but it was a familiar one. Filth was a cloak of its own, a kind of invisibility the wealthy, with their perfumes and clean linen, could never comprehend. Her target was a man named Thomas Prentice, a clerk for the wool guild with fingers that were a little too sticky and a mouth that was a little too loose. He had skimmed from the wrong accounts, spoken to the wrong ears. Now, his debt was to be paid not in shillings, but in silence. Her client, a merchant whose face she would never see again, had called it a quiet elimination. Alara knew there was no such thing. There was only the wet, shocking sound of a blade finding its home, the clumsy fall of a body suddenly robbed of its purpose, and the frantic, heart-hammering scramble into the shadows afterward. It was never quiet. The silence came later, an empty space where a man used to be. A flare of torchlight at the mouth of the alley. Two men. Their laughter echoing off the damp walls. Prentice was one of them, his portly form unmistakable. He bid his companion good night, his words slurred with ale, and turned into the narrow passage. Alone. Alara did not think of the man. To think was to hesitate. She thought of the coin purse, small but heavy, that would be hers. She thought of the apothecary's chalky powders, of the way her brother, Finn, had coughed that morning, a dry, rattling sound that seemed to tear at the very fabric of his lungs. The thought was a spur, driving her from the shadows. She moved with a practiced economy, her worn leather soles making no sound on the wet stone. Prentice hummed a bawdy tune, fumbling for the keys to his back door. He never heard her. One of her hands, small but strong, clamped over his mouth, stifling his surprised grunt. The other hand, holding a short, wickedly sharp dagger she'd stolen off a guard, found a soft spot under his ribs. It was not a clean thrust from a storybook. It was a messy, brutish shove. She felt the sickening crunch as the blade slid between bones, felt the man's body convulse against hers, a sudden, desperate shudder. He smelled of sweat and stale beer. He slumped, his weight a dead thing against her. She held him up for a moment, letting him slide quietly to the ground to avoid the clatter of his head on the stones. She pried the purse from his belt, its contents a pathetic collection of coppers and a single silver piece. Not what she was promised. It never was. She wiped her blade on the dead man's cloak, a gesture as automatic as breathing, and melted back into the deeper darkness of the alley. She was gone before Prentice's body had even begun to grow cold. She was a footnote, a whisper of violence in a city that was full of them. And as she ran, the rain washing the alley clean, she clutched the single silver coin. It was not enough. It would never be enough. The room she and Finn shared was a cold, damp box near the river, smelling perpetually of mildew and boiled cabbage. Finn was asleep, his breath a shallow whisper in the dark. The moonlight that filtered through the single grimy window illuminated the pallor of his skin, the sharp angles of his cheekbones. He was 16, but consumption was carving him into an old man. On a small crate beside his pallet lay a piece of charcoal and a scrap of parchment, a half-finished sketch of a kestrel he'd seen over the river. His lines were fine, confident, a legacy from their father, the illuminator, who could paint a whole world on a page the size of a man's palm. Elara remembered their father's hands, smelling of gesso and pigment, his quiet voice explaining how to grind malachite into a brilliant green, or how to lay down a perfect sheet of gold leaf. Now her own hands, just as steady, were used for different, darker arts. She knelt and placed the silver coin and coppers on the floor. She stared at them, the paltry sum of a man's life. It would buy a few more days of Finn's medicine, a little more time. But time was a commodity she was always running out of. Their father's death from the sweating sickness had been swift, leaving them with his modest tools and immodest debts. Elara, his apprentice, had tried to carry on his work, but the guilds were closed to a girl of 20. The debts grew. The threats from the moneylenders became more pointed. And Finn's cough had started. So she'd taken her father's sharpest vellum scraper, a tool for correcting mistakes, and made her first true correction. A moneylender's clerk in a dark alley. It had been clumsy, terrifying. She'd gotten a long, thin scar along her jaw for her trouble. But it had worked. The debts were paid for a month. And a new, terrible path had opened before her. She woke before dawn, the familiar gnawing anxiety in her stomach. As she counted the coins again, a sharp rap came at the door. Not the landlord. Not a neighbor. It was a sound with purpose, sharp and impatient. She tucked her dagger into her sleeve and opened the door a crack. A boy, no older than 10, stood there in a fine woolen livery she didn't recognize. He didn't speak, merely handed her a folded parchment sealed with dark blue wax. The sigil was a snarling wolf's head. The House of De Vere. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through her practiced calm. This was a level of power she had never brushed against. The De Veres were old blood, ruthless players in the endless, bloody game between Lancaster and York, their loyalties as shifting as the river's tide. She broke the seal. The script inside was elegant, precise. It was not a request. It was a summons. The De Vere estate was not a house, but a fortress squatting in the heart of the city, its stone walls blocking out the sky. Guards in the snarling wolf livery stood at the gates, their pikes sharp, their eyes sharper. The boy led her through a side entrance, down cold, echoing corridors where her own soft footsteps sounded like a betrayal. They passed no one. The silence was deliberate, a display of control. She was being led into the spider's web. He left her in a study lined with dark wood and shelves of leather-bound books that probably cost more than she would earn in a lifetime. A fire crackled in a great stone hearth, but it offered no warmth, only a flickering, unsettling light. A man stood with his back to her, staring into the flames. He was tall, dressed in a doublet of black velvet that seemed to drink the light from the room. "Miss Vance," he said, his voice smooth and cultured, without turning around. "They say you are a person who can solve complicated problems." He turned, and Elara's breath caught. Lord Garrick de Vere was in his 50s, impeccably groomed, his face a mask of courtly politeness. But his eyes were small and cold. The eyes of a predator that has long forgotten the thrill of the hunt and is interested only in the meal. This was the man from whom the city's whispers fled. "Competence should be rewarded, shouldn't it?" he continued, gesturing to a chair she would not take. "And your particular competence is rare. A delicate instrument for a delicate task." She remained silent, her hand resting near the dagger in her sleeve. "I have a problem," De Vere said. His smile never reaching his eyes. "A man. Sir Malcolm Thorne. A knight of tiresome piety and even more tiresome curiosity. He has uncovered certain correspondences. Misinterpreted them, of course. But his interpretation could prove inconvenient." He waved a dismissive hand. "I need him to have an accident. A quiet one." Elara's mind raced. Sir Malcolm Thorne was a known loyalist to the king, a man with a reputation for unbending honor. To move against him was to move against the crown itself. It was madness. "The price would have to be significant," she said, her voice steady. "Oh, it will be." De Vere walked to a heavy oak chest and lifted the lid. Elara saw the dull gleam of gold. More money than she had ever seen in one place. Enough to take Finn away from this damp, cursed city. Enough to buy them a new life, a clean life. The sight of it was a physical blow. A promise of a world she could barely imagine. All of this, De Vere said softly. For one small, quiet task. It was a trap. She knew it was a trap. Men like De Vere did not leave loose ends. They did not leave witnesses. But the gold, and Finn's cough. How do I know you can be trusted? She asked. De Vere's smile widened. Oh, you don't. But I know you can be. Because you see, I have already taken the liberty of ensuring your full cooperation. He rang a small silver bell. A side door opened, and a guard led Finn into the room. Her brother looked terrified, small and frail in the vast, oppressive space. He saw her and his eyes widened with confusion and fear. Finn, she gasped, taking a step forward before freezing. He is my guest, De Vere said smoothly, placing a hand on Finn's shoulder. The gesture was meant to look paternal, but it was the hand of a jailer. We discovered him this morning. Suffering from the cold. I have had my own physician attend to him. He will be safe here. Comfortable. For as long as you are, competent. The web was no longer around her. It was inside her, its silken threads wrapped tight around her heart, her lungs. She could not breathe. She looked at the gold, then at her brother's terrified face. There was no choice. There never had been. Tell me about Sir Malcolm, she said. Her voice a dead thing. Lord De Vere had provided her with a new identity, Elspeth, a scullery maid from a village in the north, her family lost to plague, seeking work in the city. The letter of recommendation, a masterful forgery with a believable history, was her key. Sir Malcolm Thorne's London manor was less of a fortress than De Vere's, but it was a place of disciplined order. The servants were long-serving and loyal, their eyes missing nothing. Elara, now Elspeth, entered a world of endless drudgery that was, in its own way, as dangerous as any battlefield. Her days were a blur of scrubbing floors, washing pots until her hands were raw, and keeping her head down. She made herself small, quiet, and slightly stupid. A ghost in the background. It was in this state of near invisibility that she could observe. The household was run with military precision. Guards patrolled the perimeter, not just at night, but during the day. Sir Malcolm, she learned, was a man of rigid habits. He rose at dawn, prayed in the family chapel, broke his fast, and then retired to his study for most of the day. He was, as De Vere had said, a man of tiresome piety. But she saw other things, too. She saw him in the courtyard, patiently teaching his 10-year-old son the basics of swordplay. His stern face softening with a rare smile. She saw him speak to his wife, Lady Annalise, with a quiet tenderness that was not for show. One evening, while clearing away the supper dishes, she overheard him reading to his young daughter, his voice a low, steady rumble as he narrated a tale of a brave knight and a clever princess. This was not the portrait of a villain. This was a man protecting his world. He is just like me, the thought came, unbidden and unwelcome. He is just trying to protect his own, she crushed the thought ruthlessly. Thinking like that was a luxury she couldn't afford. Finn's face, pale and frightened in De Vere's study, was the only image she allowed herself to see. Her greatest obstacle was the household steward, a man named Alaric. He was thin and wiry, with pale, watchful eyes that seemed to linger on her a moment too long. He had been with the Thorne family for 30 years, and he knew the rhythm of the house like his own heartbeat. Elara was a new, discordant note. One afternoon, as she was carrying a pail of slops through the kitchen, he stopped her. Elspeth, he said, his voice quiet but sharp. The last girl who came from Northwood had a pronounced lilt to her words. You do not. Elara's heart seized. A careless mistake. In her focus on appearing meek, she had forgotten the finer details of her persona. She forced her eyes to fill with tears, a trick she had learned was far more effective than any lie. "Forgive me, Master Alaric," she whimpered, letting the pail tremble in her hands. "My mother, she was from the south. She taught me to speak proper, so I wouldn't sound like a common field hand. She died last spring." She let a single tear trace a path through the grime on her cheek. Alaric stared at her. For a long, agonizing moment. His gaze was sharp, analytical. He was searching for the lie. She held her breath, focusing on the image of a fresh grave, on the real grief she still felt for her father. Finally, he gave a curt nod. "See that you do your work, then. This is no place for idlers." He turned and walked away. Elara leaned against the cold stone wall, her knees weak with relief. The encounter left her shaken. She was an amateur playing a master's game, and she was making mistakes. A week into her infiltration, De Vere granted her a visit with Finn. He was in a comfortable, sunlit room, but the door was guarded, and the window was barred. He looked better, the physician's care had brought some color back to his cheeks, and his cough was less severe. He was sketching the patterns of the light on the floor. "They are kind to me, Elara," he said, his innocence a fresh wound in her heart. "Lord De Vere gave me this fine paper. He says I have a gift. He is a powerful man, Finn. It is wise to please him." She smoothed his hair, her touch gentle. Inside, she was screaming. "When can we go home?" he asked, his voice small. "Soon," she lied, her throat tight. "I am working on something. A commission. It will pay very well. Enough for us to leave London. We'll go south, to the coast. The sea air will be good for you." As she left, Lord De Vere was waiting for her in the corridor. "He is a charming boy," the nobleman said, his eyes cold. "It would be a tragedy if his health were to take a turn for the worse. Sir Malcolm is proving more resilient than I anticipated. I am growing impatient." The threat was unspoken but absolute. "Hurry up," it said, "or the boy pays the price." The pressure was becoming unbearable. She had to act. Her plan was simple, brutal, and risky. Sir Malcolm drank a glass of mulled wine in his study every night before retiring. A poison, slow-acting and difficult to trace, introduced into the wine pitcher, would make it look like a sudden, violent illness. A stroke, perhaps. She had spent 2 of her precious coins on the poison from a shifty apothecary in Southwark, a man known as the Rat. He swore the compound, made from nightshade and other, more obscure herbs, was undetectable. She knew he was lying. All men lied. The question was how much. Her opportunity came 2 nights later. A feast was being held, and the household was in a state of controlled chaos. In the bustling kitchen, she was tasked with refilling the wine pitchers. It was the perfect moment. Her hands trembled as she uncorked the small vial she had kept hidden in the hem of her dress. The kitchen was hot, loud, full of shouting servants and clattering pans. No one was watching her. She tilted the vial over the silver pitcher destined for the master's study. Just as the first drop was about to fall, a small body collided with her legs. "Elspeth, watch out." It was Sir Malcolm's daughter, Alice, a girl of 7 with her father's serious eyes. She had been chasing a kitten through the kitchen. The collision made Elara jerk her hand. The pitcher wobbled, teetering on the edge of the table. Without thinking, she grabbed it, her other hand instinctively pushing the vial back into its hiding place. "I'm sorry," the girl said, looking up at her with wide, innocent eyes. "It is no matter, my lady," Elara mumbled, her heart hammering against her ribs. The steward, Alaric, appeared at the kitchen door. His face a thundercloud. "Lady Alice. You are not to be in here. Come." He took the girl's hand, but not before his suspicious gaze fell on Elara, on her pale face and trembling hands. He had seen something. He didn't know what, but he had seen that she was not just a clumsy scullery maid. The moment was lost. Worse, she was now under direct suspicion from the one man in the house she could not afford to have as an enemy. She had to find another way. Time was running out. That night, sleep offered no escape. She dreamt of Finn, not in a sunlit room, but in a cold, dark grave, his sketchbook clutched in his lifeless hands. Driven by a new desperation, she knew she could not rely on stealth and poison alone. She had to find a weakness, a secret. She began taking risks, lingering near the study late at night, listening at the door. One night, after the house had fallen silent, she picked the lock on the study door, a skill learned from a thief she had once shared a cell with in debtor's prison. The room was filled with the scent of beeswax and old paper. By the faint light of the moon, she searched the desk. It was neat, orderly, just like the man himself. But people, even orderly people, had secrets. Her fingers, sensitive from years of handling delicate brushes, traced the underside of the desk. She felt a small, almost imperceptible catch. A hidden compartment. She pressed it, and a thin drawer slid open with a soft click. Inside was a small cache of letters. Her heart pounded as she took them to the window, angling them to catch the moonlight. The script was familiar. It was Lord de Vere's. She couldn't read well, her father had only taught her the basics. But she could make out names. King Edward. The Duke of Clarence. And names of prominent Lancastrian nobles. It wasn't just correspondence. It was a ledger of treason. De Vere was playing both sides, selling information to the king's enemies, waiting to see who would emerge victorious from the bloody chaos of the wars. Sir Malcolm hadn't misinterpreted anything. He had discovered the truth. And beneath those letters was another. A draft written in Sir Malcolm's own hand, addressed to the king's spymaster. He was planning to expose de Vere. That was why he had to die. But it was the last parchment at the bottom of the drawer that made the blood freeze in her veins. It was a message, written in a crude hand, addressed to one of Lord de Vere's captains. It contained a detailed description of her, Elspeth, the scullery maid. It gave instructions for her to be taken and disposed of in the Thames as soon as Sir Malcolm was dead. The gold was a lie. The promise of a new life was a lie. Her death, and surely Finn's, had been part of the plan from the very beginning. She was the knife, and once the cut was made, the knife was to be thrown in the river. She sank to the floor, the letters clutched in her hand, the cold dread a physical weight in her stomach. She was not a hunter. She was the bait in a trap, and it was already closing. Panic was a wild animal clawing at the inside of her chest. Her first instinct was to run. To grab the letters, flee the manor, and disappear into the labyrinthine streets of London. But then the image of Finn's face rose before her, a prisoner in a velvet cage. De Vere would kill him without a second thought. Running was not an option. Fighting seemed impossible. She was one girl with a dagger against one of the most powerful, ruthless men in England. But the letters changed the game. They were proof. They were a weapon. She was no longer just the knife, she was the hand that held evidence of treason. The thought did not bring her comfort, only a different, sharper kind of terror. For 2 days, she went about her duties in a daze of fear, the parchments tucked into a secret pouch sewn into the lining of her chemise, their incriminating weight a constant reminder of the precipice on which she stood. Alaric the steward watched her constantly, his suspicion now a palpable thing. He knew she was not what she seemed. He was just waiting for her to make her move. She had to turn the board around. She had to stop being the pawn and become a player, however small. The only person in this city who wanted Lord de Vere dead as much as she now did was the man she was supposed to kill. The decision was born of pure desperation. It was an insane gamble, a leap into a dark abyss, but it was the only move she had left. That night, she did not go to Sir Malcolm's study with poison. She went with the truth. She picked the lock again, her hands slick with sweat. He was there, sitting at his desk, a single candle burning beside him. He wasn't drinking wine. He looked up as she entered, his face impassive, but his hand moved to rest on the hilt of the dagger at his belt. He had been expecting her. "The steward was right about you," Sir Malcolm said, his voice low and dangerous. "You are no scullery maid." "No," Elara said, her own voice barely a whisper. She took a step forward, holding her hands out, palms open, to show she was unarmed. "I was sent to kill you." He did not flinch. "By Lord de Vere, I presume." "Yes." "Then get on with it. Or did your courage fail you?" There was contempt in his voice. But also a sliver of curiosity. Instead of answering, she walked to his desk, pulled the bundle of letters from her chemise, and threw them down before him. The one detailing her own planned demise was on top. "He is playing us both, my lord. He hired me to be his dagger. Once you were dead, he planned to throw the dagger in the river." Sir Malcolm stared at her, then down at the letters. He picked up the one concerning her and read it, his expression unreadable in the flickering candlelight. He then sifted through the others, his eyes scanning the damning evidence of de Vere's treason. The silence in the room stretched, taut and thin. Elara's heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She had laid her only card on the table. He could kill her now, call the guards, and claim she was an assassin he had caught. Her life was entirely in his hands. Finally. He looked up, his gaze piercing. "Why show me this? What do you want?" "My brother," she said, the words raw. "De Vere holds him hostage to ensure my cooperation. I kill you, my brother lives until de Vere decides he is also a loose end. I fail, my brother dies. I run, my brother dies. This," she gestured to the letters, "is the only path I see where he might live. I want to destroy Garrick de Vere. And I believe, my lord, that you do, too." He studied her for a long time, his mind weighing the impossibilities. To trust an assassin, a girl from the gutters, was madness. But the evidence on his desk was undeniable. And he recognized the cold, hard glint of desperation in her eyes. It was a currency he understood. "An alliance," he said, more to himself than to her. "With a killer." He gave a short, mirthless laugh. "De Vere has made us strange bedfellows indeed." He stood up. "Very well, girl. We will play his game. But we will play it to my rules." Their plan was audacious. They would arrange a meeting. De Vere would believe it was for Elara to report her success. She would demand he bring Finn to the exchange as proof of his good faith before she confirmed the kill. The meeting place would be a semi-abandoned chapel near the old Roman wall. A place of crumbling stone and deep shadows. There, Sir Malcolm and his most trusted men would be waiting. The next day, a message was sent. Elara, playing the part of the successful but wary assassin, demanded the meeting. De Vere agreed, his reply laced with a condescending amusement. He thought he was in complete control. The night of the meeting was cold and moonless. The wind howled around the chapel's broken arches. A mournful sound. Elara stood in the nave, the air thick with the smell of damp stone and decay. She was alone, a single flickering lantern at her feet. Sir Malcolm and his 5 best men were hidden in the shadows of the choir and behind the crumbling altar, their swords drawn. Elara's nerves were stretched to the breaking point. This was it. Everything rested on this one, desperate gamble. She heard the sound of horses. Of armored men. A moment later, Lord de Vere swept into the chapel, flanked by a dozen of his own guards. He was not a fool. He had come prepared. And between 2 of his guards, pale and trembling, was Finn. "My dear girl," de Vere boomed, his voice echoing in the stone vault. "You have a flair for the dramatic. Is it done? Is the tiresome Sir Malcolm finally at peace?" Elara's eyes were locked on Finn. "Show me my brother is unharmed. Let him come to me. Then I will tell you everything." De Vere chuckled. "Of course. He nodded to one of his guards, who shoved Finn forward. As her brother stumbled towards her, De Vere's eyes darted around the chapel, his senses sharp. He saw a flicker of movement in the shadows behind the altar. His smile vanished, replaced by a mask of cold fury. "A trap," he snarled. "You foolish little chit. Did you really think it would be so simple?" He drew his own sword, its polished steel gleaming in the lantern light. "Kill them all. And make sure the boy is first." The chapel exploded into chaos. Sir Malcolm and his men burst from their hiding places, their war cries echoing off the stone. Steel rang on steel. It was not a duel of honor, it was a desperate, ugly brawl in the dark. Men grunted, cursed, and screamed. The sounds were wet, brutal. Elara saw none of it. Her world had narrowed to a single point, the guard with a long knife who was advancing on Finn. She moved without thinking, a ghost in the maelstrom. She launched herself at the guard, her stolen dagger finding the gap in his armor at the neck. He gargled and fell. She grabbed Finn, pulling him behind a thick stone pillar. "Stay here. Do not move," she screamed over the din. The fight was a whirlwind of bloody confusion. Sir Malcolm was a force of nature, his greatsword carving a path through De Vere's men. But they were outnumbered, 2-1. Elara saw one of his men go down, then another. The odds were turning against them. De Vere was not fighting. He was watching, directing his men, his face a mask of rage. He saw Elara shielding her brother. And a cruel smile twisted his lips. If he could not have his victory, he would have his revenge. He began moving towards them, his own sword held ready, cutting down one of Sir Malcolm's wounded men who got in his way. Elara knew she couldn't fight him head-on. He was larger, stronger, a trained swordsman. She had only her speed and her desperation. She shoved Finn deeper into the shadows. "Run if you can," she whispered. Her voice choked. She saw an opening. Sir Malcolm engaged De Vere, their swords clashing in a shower of sparks. De Vere was the better swordsman, and he was slowly driving the knight back. Elara circled around them, silent as a wraith. De Vere was focused entirely on his opponent, his back exposed for a fleeting second as he parried a heavy blow. It was the only chance she would get. She sprang from behind a pillar. Her dagger held in a reverse grip. She was not a soldier, she was an assassin. She did not fight fair. She drove the blade with all her strength into the space between his neck and his shoulder armor, severing muscle and artery. Lord De Vere froze. A look of profound surprise crossed his face. He made a soft, gurgling sound and dropped his sword. He turned his head slowly, his cold eyes finding hers. In them, she saw not hatred, but a kind of final, grudging respect for the tool that had turned against its master. Then he crumpled to the floor, a puppet with its strings cut. With their lord dead, the remaining De Vere guards faltered. The fight became a rout. Sir Malcolm's men cut down 2 more before the rest broke and fled into the night, leaving a litter of bodies on the chapel floor. Silence fell, broken only by the ragged breathing of the survivors and the soft moan of a dying man. The victory was absolute. De Vere was dead. His treasonous letters were safe. Elara had won. She turned, her heart soaring with a wild, desperate hope she hadn't felt in years. Finn. She saw him then, not hiding behind the pillar where she had left him, but lying on the cold flagstones a few feet away. In the chaos of the final moments. As she had moved to strike De Vere, one of Lorenzo's guards, flailing in his own death throes, had swung his sword blindly. A backhanded, accidental blow. But it had found its mark. A dark stain was spreading across the front of Finn's simple tunic. She rushed to his side, dropping to her knees. "No," she whispered, the word a prayer, a denial. "No, Finn, no." She gathered him into her arms. He was so light. His eyes fluttered open, unfocused, searching for her face. "Elara," he whispered, his voice faint. A trickle of blood ran from the corner of his mouth. "I'm here," she choked out, stroking his hair. "I'm here. It's over. We're safe." He tried to smile, a weak, ghostly thing. "Did you see the moon tonight?" he coughed, a wet, rattling sound. It was the color of old pearl. "One day. I will." His voice trailed off. His eyes lost their focus, staring up at the dark, vaulted ceiling of the chapel as if seeing something far beyond it. His last breath was a soft sigh, a quiet release. And then he was still. The hope that had soared within her shattered into a million ice-sharp pieces. She held him, rocking back and forth in the silence, the warmth slowly leaving his small body. The world had gone silent, muffled. As if she were underwater. The smell of blood and death was overwhelming. She had killed and schemed and fought and won, and the prize was this, a cold, empty weight in her arms. The blood money, the new life, the clean sea air, it was all ash. The future she had been fighting for had just died with her brother. Sir Malcolm approached her, his steps heavy. He was wounded, a long gash on his arm, but he was alive. He looked down at her and Finn, his stern face filled with a deep, weary pity. He said nothing for a long time. There was nothing to say. Finally, he spoke, his voice rough. "The official story will be that Lord de Vere and his men were set upon by bandits on the road. A tragic loss for the city." He knelt, taking the heavy purse of gold from de Vere's belt. He held it out to her. It was the same purse de Vere had shown her. The one that had sealed her fate. "This is yours. The price he offered you." Elara stared at the gold as if it were a viper. It was the price of her service. The price of her soul. The price of her brother's life. "Take it," Sir Malcolm said, his voice softer now. "Take it and disappear. There is no place for you in London now. There is no Elspeth the maid. There is no Elara Vance. You were never here. Your brother, he was never here. You do not exist." His words were not cruel. They were a gift, the only one he could give her. The gift of erasure. He was offering her the one thing an assassin craved and dreaded most, a clean slate, bought with blood. She looked at Finn's peaceful, empty face, then at the gold. With numb fingers, she took the purse. It was heavy, obscene. They buried Finn in an unmarked grave in the unconsecrated ground behind the chapel, beneath a lonely yew tree. There was no priest, no ceremony. Just Elara, Sir Malcolm, and his two remaining men. She stood over the freshly turned earth as the first light of dawn began to grey the eastern sky. She felt nothing. She was a hollow thing, scooped out and empty. She had perfected the art of becoming a ghost, and now her own spirit had fled. Sir Malcolm gave her a horse and a new cloak. A thick, dark wool without insignia. "Ride south," he advised. "To the coast. Find a ship. Do not look back." He met her eyes one last time, a shared, silent understanding passing between the honorable knight and the gutter rat killer. They were two survivors of de Vere's poison, bound by a night of violence, and now they would walk away from each other forever. She rode for a week, sleeping in haylofts and hidden woods. Eating dried bread and cheese she bought in villages where no one knew her face. She spoke to no one. Her name was ash in her mouth. She was a spectre moving through a world that no longer contained any meaning. The grief was a physical presence, a cold stone in her belly. Sometimes, she would wake up in the night, reaching for Finn, the memory of his cough, his smile, so vivid it was a fresh wound. Then the emptiness would rush back in, a black tide. She reached the coast, a town bustling with the noise of sailors and merchants, the air sharp with the scent of salt and tar. It was a place of transit, of new beginnings and final departures. A perfect place to vanish. She sold the horse for a handful of coins and walked the docks, a hooded, anonymous figure among the crowds. She found a merchant ship bound for the free cities of the continent. A place where names and histories could be bought and sold. She paid the captain with one of De Vere's gold coins, not even haggling over the price. The captain, a man with shrewd, calculating eyes, looked from the coin to her cloaked face, but asked no questions. Gold was its own language, and it asked only to be spent. As the ship pulled away from the dock, leaving the shores of England behind, Elara stood at the rail, the sea wind whipping at her cloak. She watched the land recede until it was just a faint, grey line on the horizon. She opened the heavy purse. The gold coins gleamed dully in the pale light. She thought of taking them and casting them into the sea, a final, defiant gesture. But she didn't. They were all she had left. A payment for a ghost. She clutched the purse, the cold metal a familiar weight in her hand. She was alone, adrift, with a fortune she didn't want and a future she hadn't planned for. She had survived. She was free. And she was utterly, completely, irrevocably nothing. A whisper. A rumor. A shadow that had already faded from a story that no one would ever tell. The ship sailed on, carrying a ghost across the water, and the world did not notice she was gone, because it had never truly known she was there at all. The first year was a blur of ports. Of foreign tongues and unfamiliar faces. Elara moved through the coastal cities of France and the Low Countries like a wraith, never staying in one place for more than a few weeks. She learned to be someone else every time she stepped off a boat. In Bruges, she was a pilgrim's widow. In Calais, a weaver's runaway apprentice. Names became like cloaks, to be put on and discarded with the changing weather. She slept in cheap inns when she had to, but preferred barns and abandoned sheds. She ate sparingly, hoarding the gold, though she wasn't sure what she was hoarding it for. It was a weight that kept her anchored to the earth, a constant reminder of the life she had bought and the one she had lost. She never touched a blade for hire. The thought of it brought a cold sickness to her stomach. But the instincts remained, ingrained and sharp. She always sat with her back to the wall. She clocked every exit in every room she entered. She trusted no one. The friendly smiles of strangers were masks, their questions potential traps. Her isolation was a fortress, and she locked herself inside it. The grief for Finn did not lessen. It changed. It settled deep inside her, a cold, hard stone that nothing could warm. In her dreams, she was always back in the chapel, holding his cooling body, the smell of blood and rain in her nostrils. She would wake up with a silent scream caught in her throat, her hands clenched into fists. Sometimes, during the day, she would see a boy in the street with dark, curly hair and a slight frame, and her heart would stop, a moment of impossible, agonizing hope, before reality crashed back down on her. She tried to spend the money. She bought a fine wool dress once, thinking it might make her feel like a different person, a lady. But the fabric felt alien against her skin, a costume for a part she didn't know how to play. She gave it to a beggar girl the next day. She tried to lose herself in wine, but it only sharpened the edges of her grief and dulled the senses she needed to stay alive. The gold remained a curse, a pile of dead weight in the bottom of her satchel. After 2 years of aimless wandering, she found herself in Ghent, a city of canals and imposing cloth halls. The relentless dampness of the place reminded her of London, of the room she had shared with Finn. The memories, instead of fading, were becoming sharper. She realized with a jolt of terror that she was forgetting the sound of his laugh. She could remember his cough perfectly, the sound of his pain, but the sound of his joy was slipping away, like a watercolor left in the rain. The thought terrified her more than any blade. To lose that was to lose him completely. That night, she made a decision. The wandering had to end. Running from the ghost was pointless when the ghost was inside her. She found work. Not as an assassin, but something that used the same skills, the same hands. She found a master cartographer, an old man with failing eyesight named Henrik, whose workshop was cluttered with charts and strange, brass instruments. She showed him her handiwork, not with a dagger, but with a quill. She copied a section of a map for him, her lines as fine and steady as any scribe's. He saw the precision in her work, the patience. He hired her on the spot. Her new life was one of quiet routine. She spent her days in the dusty, sunlit workshop, mixing inks, copying coastlines onto fresh vellum, and learning the science of stars and tides. For the first time in years, her hands were used to create, not to destroy. She was still Alara the ghost, but now she was a ghost with a purpose, however small. She was charting the world she had been adrift in. She kept to herself, speaking little to Henrik or his other apprentices. But the work was a balm. In the meticulous, ordered world of lines and measurements, she found a strange kind of peace. The world, which had seemed a chaotic, hostile place, became something that could be understood, measured, and mapped. One day, Henrik brought in a new commission. It was from a wealthy spice merchant who wanted a personal atlas, a book of maps charting the trade routes from Lisbon to the Levant. It was a massive, expensive undertaking. As Alara was preparing the vellum, stretching and treating it with pumice, she saw the merchant's sigil at the bottom of the commission papers. It was a snarling wolf's head. The air left her lungs. It couldn't be. Not here. Not after all this time. But the design was identical to the one on the wax seal that had summoned her to Lord de Vere's study 3 years ago. Her blood ran cold. The merchant, she learned from the papers, was an Englishman, Sir Reginald Croft. A man who had recently risen to prominence, his wealth new and his connections powerful. She did some digging, using the quiet, observational skills she had honed in the shadows. She listened to the gossip in the taverns on the merchant's wharf. Sir Reginald, they said, had made his fortune through a series of incredibly lucky investments, buying out rivals just before they fell into ruin. His rise had been meteoric, and it had started about 3 years ago, shortly after the convenient death of a powerful London nobleman named de Vere. Some whispered that Croft had been one of de Vere's agents, his most secret and successful one, who had used his master's fall to seize his assets and erase his own past. The ghost she thought she had buried had come back to haunt her. Croft was the last thread connecting her to that night in the chapel. He was a loose end. And she knew what happened to loose ends. It was only a matter of time before he learned of the mapmaker's apprentice with the steady hands and the English accent, the girl who had appeared in Ghent from nowhere. It was only a matter of time before he decided to tie that thread. The old fear returned, coiling in her gut. Her first instinct was to run again. To pack her satchel, take the gold, and disappear. But then she thought of Finn. She thought of his stolen life, of the injustice of it all. De Vere was dead, but the poison he had spread was still alive in the world, thriving in the form of men like Croft. Running had not brought her peace. It had only prolonged the haunting. She looked at her hands, stained with ink, not blood. For 3 years, she had tried to be someone else. But you could not map a new world while a monster from the old one was still hunting you. She went to the secret compartment in the floorboards of her small room and took out the dagger she had carried from London. She had kept it clean, sharp. A relic. A promise. She looked at its reflection, at the face of the woman staring back at her. The cartographer's apprentice was gone. Alara Vance, the ghost of London, was back. And this time, she would not be the one who was hunted. She would be the one who finished the map. The task of finding a way to Sir Reginald Croft was different from her past work. He was not a nobleman in a fortified manner, but a merchant. His fortress was wealth, his guards were clerks and dockhands, his walls were ledgers and contracts. But he was just as dangerous, and far more paranoid. He lived in a grand house in the wealthiest quarter of Ghent, a house that was always watched. Alara did not try to force her way in. She used her new life as her disguise. As Henrik's most trusted apprentice, she was tasked with delivering proofs of the maps to Croft for his approval. On her first visit, she was just a quiet, humble scribe. She kept her eyes downcast, her voice soft. She allowed herself to look plain, unremarkable. But she missed nothing. She noted the number of guards, the locks on the doors, the layout of the house. She saw the way Croft dismissed her with a wave of his hand, his eyes never truly registering her face. To him, she was furniture. It was the perfect cover. Her plan formed slowly, meticulously, like one of her maps. It was not a plan of brute force, but of poison. The same method she had failed to use on Sir Malcolm Thorne. But this time, she would not be a clumsy amateur. She had learned. She spent weeks researching, not in grimoires, but in books of alchemy and botany from Henrik's own library, under the guise of studying pigments. She learned of a certain mushroom, the destroying angel, which, when dried and powdered, could be introduced into wine. It was tasteless, odorless, and its effects mimicked a sudden, violent cholera. A death that would be tragic, but not suspicious, in a city like Ghent. She made 3 more visits to Croft's house, each time delivering a new map, each time gathering more details. She learned his habits. Like Sir Malcolm, he drank a glass of specific, expensive wine from the south every night. The wine was kept in a locked cabinet in his study, and only he had the key. The challenge was getting the poison into a locked cabinet. But Alara had learned from her past. Direct assault was foolish. The answer lay in the supply chain. She traced the wine merchant who supplied Croft. She spent a week watching him, learning his routes, his habits. She discovered he was a man with a weakness for gambling. One night, in a smoky, low-ceiling tavern by the docks, she accidentally spilled a drink on him. In the ensuing apology, her nimble fingers lifted the keys to his storeroom. She was gone before he even noticed they were missing. That night, she let herself into his warehouse. Using a fine syringe, a tool used by illuminators to apply tiny drops of gum arabic, she injected a lethal dose of the powdered poison through the cork of a single bottle in a crate destined for Sir Reginald Croft. She was back in her room before dawn, the keys returned to the drunk, sleeping merchant's pocket by a street urchin she paid with a copper. It was a perfect, untraceable crime. All she had to do now was wait. A week later, the news spread through the city. The wealthy merchant, Sir Reginald Croft, was dead. Struck down in his prime by a terrible affliction of the stomach. The physicians were baffled. The city mourned the loss of a great man of commerce. Alara felt a grim, cold satisfaction. It was not justice. Justice was a fantasy for poets. It was simply balance. A correction on a crooked map. That evening, Henrik gave her the news that the commission for the atlas had been cancelled by Croft's heirs. The workshop was quiet. Alara stood looking at the half-finished map of the Levant on her worktable. Its beautiful, precise lines seemed to mock her. A pity, Henrik said, peering at her over his spectacles. Your work on this was your finest yet, my girl. Your lines are as steady as any master's. He paused, his old eyes thoughtful. You know, when that English lord first died, I thought we had lost the work. But his heir, a distant cousin I believe, has renewed the commission. He wishes for one change only. What change? Alara asked, her voice tight. He wants the De Vere family crest added to the title page, alongside the Croft wolf. A gesture to honor a fallen associate, he says. Henrik sighed. These powerful men and their games. Still, the money is good. Alara stared at the map. She had cut off one head of the Hydra. And another had already grown in its place. She had not erased the past. She had only proven that the web was infinitely larger than she had ever imagined. De Vere, Croft, the new heir, they were all just replaceable parts in a vast, self-perpetuating machine of greed and violence. A machine that had consumed her brother and her soul. She had a choice. She could take her gold and run again, spend the rest of her life looking over her shoulder for the next ghost. Or she could stay and fight a war she could never win, becoming a permanent fixture in the world she despised. She looked at her hands, stained with the brilliant blue of an ink used to chart the sea. She thought of Finn, not as a broken body in a chapel, but as a boy sketching a bird, trying to capture something beautiful and free. Her fight was not with one man, or even a dozen. It was with the world that made them. A world that valued gold over life, power over innocence. She couldn't destroy that world. But she could make it fear the shadows. She could be the ghost that haunted its edges, the quiet, unseen correction. She picked up her quill. "I will need more vellum," she said to Henrik, her voice clear and steady for the first time in years. "And a new pot of ink. A very deep, permanent black." Her war was not over. It had just begun. And she would chart it all, one quiet elimination at a time. Story 4. The first rule of survival at Castle Blackwood was that the laughter must never stop. Especially when you wanted to scream. The great hall roared, a beast made of 100 drunken throats, its breath hot with the smell of roasted boar and spilled wine. Torches spat and hissed in their iron sconces, casting flickering, monstrous shadows that danced with the fools. And tonight, as on every night for the past 2 years, the greatest fool was Pip. She landed in a clumsy somersault, the bells on her motley tunic and curled shoes chiming a discordant song of forced merriment. A wave of laughter, sharp and cruel, washed over her. She rose with a grin plastered on her face, a mask of idiocy that had taken years to perfect. It was a good mask. It had to be. Beneath it, Philippa Beaumont was suffocating. "Another, fool," bellowed a thick-necked baron, his face flushed with mead. "Show us how Lord Ancroft trips over his own sword." Pip bowed low, the floppy points of her coxcomb hat brushing the greasy rushes on the floor. "As you wish, my lord," she chirped, her voice pitched a little higher, a little more witless than her own. "But to imitate a man of such gravitational challenges, I would first need to consume 3 more pies." Another roar, this one appreciative. The joke landed squarely, mocking Baron Stenbridge's own considerable girth while seeming to aim at a rival. It was a delicate dance, this tightrope walk over the egos of powerful men. One misstep, one joke that cut a whisper too deep, and the fall wasn't into a safety net. It was into a dungeon. Her eyes, grey and sharp, flickered across the high table. They skimmed past the bored ladies, the braying knights, and settled, as they always did, on him. Lord Valerius Blackwood. He wasn't laughing. He rarely did. He watched, his chin resting on a closed fist, a small, knowing smile playing on his lips. He was a handsome man, with hair the color of spun gold and eyes the blue of a winter sky. But there was a coldness there, a predator's stillness that chilled the air around him. He enjoyed Pip's wit not as a simple pleasure, but as an intellectual curiosity, like a man admiring the intricate workings of a trap. It was his gaze, more than any threat of the whip, that terrified her. Because sometimes, she felt he could see straight through the bells and the bright, clashing colors. She felt he could see the girl hiding inside the fool. Standing near the wall, a pillar of silent judgment, was the other man who watched her. Sir Callan, captain of the guard. A mountain of a man, grey-bearded and grim, his face a roadmap of old battles. His gaze wasn't curious, it was appraising, heavy, and constant. He watched her not as a fool, but as a discrepancy, a puzzle he hadn't yet solved. Every time his eyes met hers, Pip's heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. A frantic counterpoint to the jester's song. She launched into her imitation, her nimble body twisting into a parody of a pompous, clumsy nobleman. The hall shook with laughter. She smiled, she bowed, she jingled. And inside, she counted. 5 years. 5 years since the fires. 5 years since her father's name, Beaumont, had been erased from the world, replaced with the word traitor. Later, in the cold solitude of her garret room, a space barely larger than a broom closet, tucked away behind the kitchens, the mask came off. Pip ceased to exist. Philippa emerged, her face stark and pale and the sliver of moonlight slanting through a grimy arrow slit. She touched the faint, silvery line on her lower lip. A gift from a falling, burning roof beam. The only physical thing she had left of that night. Her reflection in a shard of polished steel was a stranger's. The cropped black hair. The lean, wiry frame honed by years on the run and performing acrobatics. It was a boy's image, a fool's image. But the eyes were her father's. Eyes that had once looked upon her with such love, now burned with a cold, patient fire. She unpacked her mind, laying out the evening's events like treasures on a threadbare blanket. Every word, every glance. Valerius's smile. Kalen's stare. The Baron's insult. They were pieces. All she needed was the one that fit, the one that would unlock the truth. The inciting moment came a week later, during the feast celebrating the anniversary of the Battle of Greyfen, the victory that had solidified Lord Valerius's power in the north. The wine flowed more freely than water, and with it, the tongues of men loosened. Valerius himself was in a rare, expansive mood. To victory, he toasted. His voice carrying easily over the din, and to the cleansing of the vipers from our midst. He was telling the story again. The story of the noble houses that had supposedly betrayed his father to his enemies. The story of the Beaumonts. Philippa stood near the high table, frozen behind her grin, a jester made of stone. They were clever, I'll grant them that, Valerius said, a cruel nostalgia in his voice. Lord Beaumont, especially. A man of letters and laws. But in the end, all his plotting was undone, by a simple flaw in a piece of metal. He chuckled, a low, rumbling sound. A family signet ring, you see. It had a hairline crack. When pressed into the wax of a treasonous letter, it left an imperceptible mark. A broken circle. Proof of a broken oath. The hall murmured. It was a dramatic detail. A storyteller's flourish. But to Philippa, the words were a physical blow. A broken signet ring. That was a detail no one outside the inner circle of the plot could possibly know. Her father's ring, the one he had worn every day of his life, had been flawless. It was a lie. A specific, calculated lie. And in that lie was the key. He knew. Valerius didn't just inherit the spoils of her family's destruction. He was its architect. The world seemed to tilt. The torchlight swam, the laughter faded to a distant buzz. For a terrifying second, she felt her mask slip, the fool's grin faltering, her face contorting with a grief so raw, so pure, it would have been her death sentence. She bit down hard on her scarred lip, the sharp pain a welcome anchor. She forced the muscles of her face back into their familiar, idiotic shape. She picked up 3 fallen apples from the floor and began to juggle, her hands moving with a desperate, flawless precision. The laughter must never stop. Especially now. Because now, she wasn't just surviving. She was hunting. And she knew, with chilling certainty, what she was hunting for. A letter sealed with a broken ring. A lie pressed into wax. Proof. And it was here, somewhere within the cold stone walls of Castle Blackwood. The castle, once her prison, was now her hunting ground. Every shadow held a secret, every locked door a possibility. Her life as Pip, the transparent fool everyone saw but no one noticed, became her greatest weapon. But the castle guarded its secrets well. The most vital of them, she knew, would be kept in the one place a fool had no business being, the Lord's private library. The library was the domain of Maester Elric. A man whose spine was as rigid as the shelves he tended and whose love for silence was matched only by his disdain for jesters. Getting the key from him was a frontal assault she could not win. Subtlety was required. One afternoon, when Elric was meticulously cataloguing new manuscripts in the scriptorium adjacent to the library, Pip struck. She didn't sneak. She burst in, a whirlwind of color and noise, chasing a rogue chicken she had borrowed from the kitchens. "Apologies, Maester," she yelped, tumbling over a stool and sending a stack of parchment flying. "This feathered fiend has a thirst for knowledge. Or perhaps it merely wishes to critique your penmanship." Elric's face turned a shade of plum. As he shrieked at her, flustered and furious, trying to shoo both her and the clucking chicken out. Pip's nimble fingers, hidden by the chaos of her fall, deftly lifted the heavy iron key from the hook on his belt, pressed it into a lump of soft wax she had palmed, and returned it in the space of a single, frantic heartbeat. "Out! Out, you painted menace," he screeched. "As you wish," Pip cried, scooping up the chicken. "This place is too quiet anyway. It dulls the wit." She scampered out, leaving an apoplectic maester and a few scattered feathers in her wake. That night, clutching a freshly cut key made by the castle blacksmith in exchange for a scandalous song about his rival, she approached the library. The lock turned with a groan that sounded as loud as a scream in the sleeping castle. The air inside was cool and smelled of aged paper, leather, and dust, the scent of buried words. Moonlight streamed through the high arched windows, illuminating towers of books that rose like silent, sleeping giants. For a moment, Philippa felt a pang of longing. This was her father's world. She could almost see him here, his head bent over a tome, a quiet smile on his face. The feeling vanished, replaced by cold resolve. She moved silently, a ghost in motley, her eyes scanning the shelves. Where would Valerius hide such a thing? Not in plain sight. It had to be somewhere personal, somewhere meaningful only to him. She searched his private desk, prying at false bottoms, tapping panels for hollow sounds. Nothing. Hours bled away, the moon arcing across the sky, until the first hint of dawn threatened the eastern horizon. She left with nothing but the dust of failure on her hands. Her nightly excursions did not go unnoticed. A few days later, as she practiced juggling in a secluded courtyard, a shadow fell over her. "You keep late hours, fool." It was Sir Calin. He stood with his arms crossed, his presence blotting out the sun. His voice was a low rumble, devoid of accusation but heavy with meaning. "The best jokes are born in the moonlight, Sir Captain," Pip said, not missing a beat, her hands a blur. "The sun is too honest for true comedy." "Is that what you were seeking in the West Wing?" "Honesty?" he asked. His eyes narrowed. "The library is a long way from your chambers." Her heart froze. She let one of the balls drop, a calculated fumble. "Ah, you found me out. I confess, I was searching for a rhyme for Valerius. So far, the best I have is glorious, but that feels a bit sycophantic, even for me." Calin didn't smile. "A fool's curiosity can be as fatal as a lord's ambition. There are books in that library that do not tell jokes. Remember that." He turned and walked away, leaving her with a racing pulse and the unnerving feeling of being understood. He had warned her. Why? The psychological pressure mounted. Lord Valerius, as if sensing her desperation, began to summon her more frequently to his private solar. These were not commands to perform, but to talk. He would pour himself wine, gesture for her to sit on a stool at his feet, and simply watch her, a smirk playing on his lips. "Tell me, Pip," he said one evening, swirling the dark red liquid in his goblet. "You are a quick-witted thing. Quicker than most of my bannermen. Where does a fool learn such sharpness?" "From his betters, my lord," she replied, her gaze fixed on the floor. "By listening to the wise words of men like yourself, and then doing the exact opposite." He laughed. A genuine, sharp bark of amusement. "Clever. Too clever, perhaps." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "You have the eyes of a hawk, little fool. Not a dove. They see everything. What do they see when they look at me?" It was a test. A trap laid in silk and wine. She had to answer. "They see a great lord," Philippa said, her voice steady, the words tasting like ash. "A lion whose roar is the law of the land." "A lion," Valerius mused, leaning back. "Yes. I like that. But even lions have jackals who nip at their heels." "Be sure you remain a songbird," Pip. Not a jackal. The threat was clear. He was playing with her, enjoying the power he held over her every breath. She left the solar feeling flayed, her composure hanging by a thread. A breakthrough came from an unexpected source. In the kitchens, she overheard two guards, flush with ale, complaining about a cantankerous old soldier named Jory who was now a gatekeeper at the eastern postern. Still talks about the old days, one grumbled. Still boasts of being there when they strung up that traitor Beaumont. Says he saw the whole thing. A human target. It took her a week to get close to Jory. He was a sour, suspicious man. She brought him stolen pastries, listened to his boring stories, and made him the hero of bawdy songs. Finally, one rainy night, she steered the conversation. It must have been a grand sight, she said, feigning awe. Seeing a great lord fall. Jory spat. Grand? It was a butcher's work. Beaumont never even spoke in his own defense. Just stood there. He squinted, his memory stirring. Funny thing, though. The Lord's clerk who read the charges, he had a tremor in his hand. Shook so much he almost dropped the scroll. And the seal on it. I remember thinking it looked odd. Chipped like. A chipped seal. A nervous clerk. More pieces. The clerk, a man named Lucius, had died of a fever a year after the execution. Convenient. But his records, his letters, they might still exist. They would be in the castle archives, a section of the library she hadn't dared to explore. That night, fueled by a new, desperate hope, she returned to the library. But she was reckless. The fear of Valerius and the proximity of the truth made her clumsy. As she was prying open a records chest, a floorboard creaked behind her. She spun around, a small dagger she kept hidden in her boot now in her hand. Sir Callan stood in the doorway, a lantern held aloft. His face was unreadable in the flickering light. This was it. It was over. He didn't call the guards. He simply looked at the dagger, then at her terrified face. He took a slow step into the room. That's a nobleman's grip, he said, his voice quiet. Not a jester's. Your footwork is sloppy, though. You're putting too much weight on your back leg. You'd be on the floor before you got a single strike in. Philippa stared, speechless. He knew. He didn't know who she was. But he knew what she wasn't. Whoever you are, Callan continued, his voice low and urgent, this is a foolish game. Valerius is not a man to be trifled with. He smells deceit like a wolf smells blood. Whatever you're looking for, it isn't worth your life. You don't know what it's worth, she whispered, her voice cracking, the sound of Philippa, not Pip. He held her gaze for a long moment, a silent battle of wills and wits passing between them. Then he sighed, a deep, weary sound. The archives are watched. The chests are trapped. But the old maester's personal correspondence, he was a man who hated Valerius's father. He kept his own records. Look for the book with the heron clasp. And be gone before the morning. He turned and left, plunging her back into darkness, leaving her with a gift more precious and more dangerous than any key, a thread of trust in a world of lies. He had chosen a side. Or perhaps, he had simply chosen a person over the system. For Philippa, it was the first crack of light in 5 years of darkness. A terrifying, beautiful, and possibly fatal light. The news arrived on the wings of a lathered horse, its rider shouting of banners and marching men. Lord Elmsworth, Valerius's most bitter rival to the south, had moved his army. It wasn't war, not yet. But it was a challenge. A wave of paranoia, cold and swift, washed over Castle Blackwood. The great portcullis groaned shut. The gates were barred. No one was to enter or leave. The castle had become a sealed tomb. For Philippa, the news was a death knell. Her time had run out. Armed with Kalen's information, she knew she had one last chance, a final, desperate gamble before Valerius's tightening fist crushed everyone in its grip. That night, the castle hummed with a nervous energy. Guards clanked down corridors in pairs, their eyes sharp and suspicious. The air was thick with the metallic scent of fear. She found the book with the heron clasp tucked away in a dusty alcove of the maester's office, a room within the library she hadn't dared enter before. Her fingers, trembling, fumbled with the latch. Inside, the book was hollow. And nestled within the hollowed-out pages was a thin, leather-bound ledger. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She opened it. The spidery, precise script of the old clerk, Lucius, filled the pages. It was a private diary. And on the pages dated the week of her family's execution, the truth was laid bare. Lord V's father demanded a new seal be forged, one with a flaw. I was forced to witness the signing. The Duke of Ancroft was present, a promise of his lands in exchange for his silence, Lord Beaumont was innocent. We have murdered an honorable man. May God have mercy on my soul, It was all there. Names. Dates. The conspiracy, written in the hand of a guilty man. This was more than proof. It was a weapon. A floorboard creaked in the outer library. She shoved the ledger into the oilskin pouch hidden beneath her motley tunic just as the door to the office swung open. Lord Valerius stood there, flanked by 2 guards. He wasn't smiling. His handsome face was a mask of cold fury. I grow tired of games, Pip, he said, his voice dangerously soft. There is a viper in my castle. A spy. And my guards tell me my clever little fool has been asking too many questions, wandering too many halls. Your jokes have cut too close to the bone lately. Whose words are you truly speaking? He didn't know about the ledger. He didn't know who she was. This was a paranoid purge, and she was the first on his list. Only my own, my lord, she said, her mind racing. A fool's words are like the wind, they go where they please. This wind, Valerius hissed, blows from the south, I think. From Elmsworth. He nodded to the guards. Seize him. We'll see how well he jests with a hot poker to his feet. The guards moved forward. Philippa backed away, her hand instinctively going to the dagger in her boot. It was over. Halt. The voice was like the crack of a whip. Sir Kalen stood in the doorway, his hand on the hilt of his great sword. He had come. Sir Kalen, Valerius said, his eyes narrowing. This does not concern you. The fool is a spy. The boy is a fool, my lord. Nothing more, Kalen said, stepping into the room. Placing himself between Pip and Valerius. He saw the bulge of the ledger under her tunic. He saw the terror and resolve in her eyes. And in that instant, he understood. He has been in this office. He has seen things, Valerius insisted. I will have the truth from him. Seize him, I said. Kalen did not move. My lord, in these tense times, to harm a licensed fool, it is a sign of instability. Your men are nervous. Do not give them a reason to doubt your composure. It was a brilliant, desperate gambit. An appeal to Valerius's pride, his greatest weakness. For a second, it almost worked. Valerius hesitated. But then his gaze fell upon Philippa's hand, which was clenched white-knuckled around the hidden pouch. What are you hiding, fool? He whispered. The game was up. There was no more time for lies. Philippa met his gaze. And for the first time, she let the fool die. She let Philippa Beaumont look out from her eyes. She drew a deep breath. And she performed. It was her final, greatest show. Her voice, clear and strong, rang out in the silent library. It was not Pip's voice. It was the voice of a noblewoman. I will tell you a story, my lord. A fable for our troubled times. Valerius stared, momentarily stunned by the change in her. "It is the story of a great wolf," she announced, her eyes never leaving his, who coveted a sheep's pasture. But the shepherd was strong and loved by his flock. So the wolf forged a secret pact with a jealous fox. They planted a dead lamb in the shepherd's field, and the wolf howled that the shepherd was a butcher. And all the other animals, fearing the wolf's teeth, believed him. The guards shifted uncomfortably. This was no fable. The wolf took the pasture, she continued, her voice rising with passion, and grew fat and powerful. But he kept a souvenir of his crime. The dead lamb's fleece, a testament to his lie. She pulled the ledger from her tunic, holding it aloft like a holy relic. He kept it to admire his own cleverness. But he forgot that truth, like the sun, will always find a way to rise. Treason. Valerius shrieked, his face contorted in a mask of pure rage. He lunged. It happened in a blur. Calon roared, drawing his sword, not to attack Pip, but to block Valerius's path. To me, he yelled to the guards, a command of pure, defiant chaos. The guards, confused, looked from their lord to their captain. That was the moment Philippa had been given. She didn't run. She acted. She threw a heavy, silver inkwell towards the far window, shattering it and drawing every eye. As heads turned, she shoved the precious ledger deep into Calon's hands. For the north, she whispered. She scrambled onto the great oak desk, her jester's agility serving her one last time. She ran its length, a flash of color and desperation. Valerius, shaking off Calon, turned back to her, his face a promise of a slow, agonizing death. With a final, desperate prayer to a god she no longer believed in, she leapt. Not for the door, but for the huge, stained-glass window depicting a long-dead saint. The glass exploded outwards in a shower of colored shards. For a breathtaking moment, she hung in the air, a broken angel in motley. Then she fell, down into the churning, black water of the river that ran beneath the castle walls. The last thing she saw was Sir Calon, his sword raised, standing alone against his lord. A grim, final bastion in a world of lies. The last thing she heard was not laughter, but the sound of steel on steel. The river was a shock of icy violence. It pulled her down, the weight of her wet clothes a death shroud. But the instinct to live, the same feral instinct that had kept Philippa Beaumont alive for 5 years, was stronger. She fought her way to the surface, gasping, her lungs burning. The ledger was gone, entrusted to Calon. Her mission was, in a sense, complete. But she was adrift, a piece of flotsam in the cold, indifferent darkness. She washed ashore a mile downstream, battered, bruised, and utterly alone. She lay on the muddy bank, shivering uncontrollably, and looked back at the distant silhouette of Castle Blackwood. It stood against the moonlit sky, a jagged tooth of stone and sorrow. It had been her prison, her stage, and the tomb of her family. Now, it was just a memory. A scar on the landscape, just like the one on her lip. Weeks bled into one another. The motley was burned, the bells silenced forever. In the smoky corner of a grimy tavern in a southern port town, a thin, quiet youth with haunted eyes listened more than they spoke. Philippa learned to be invisible in a different way, not with noise and color, but with silence and shadow. News traveled slowly, carried on the tongues of merchants and mercenaries. There was unrest in the north. Lord Valerius Blackwood's position was precarious. Rumors of a dead clerk's diary, of a sworn confession from a dying captain of the guard, were circulating, poisoning his name. His rival, Lord Elmsworth, was pressing his advantage. The system, that great, unthinking beast, had been wounded. The ledger had found its mark. But Valerius still ruled. The beast was not dead. Such things rarely died so easily. Sir Calon, they said, had been executed for treason. He had bought her life with his own. The weight of that knowledge was a heavier burden than any costume. One grey morning, Philippa took the last of her coin and bought a sturdy, unremarkable horse. She had the truth. She had her revenge, or a bitter taste of it. The name Beaumont might one day be cleared in some dusty, official scroll. But the girl who had borne that name was gone. Pip, the fool, was also gone. As she rode out of the town, she didn't look back. There was nothing to look back to. Before her was the road, a ribbon of mud and uncertainty stretching into a horizon empty of promises. She was free from the castle, but she would forever be a prisoner of what she had done, and what had been done to her. She was a ghost, a story, a survivor who had forgotten the shape of her own face. The laughter had finally stopped. And in the profound, terrifying silence that remained, she rode on.